Chapter 38. The 70s. We were still stinging from the defeat of our Kansas City Chiefs at the hands of the Green Bay Packers in the very first Super Bowl. However, the decade of the 70s got off on the right foot when the Chiefs defeated the Minnesota Vikings 23-7 in Super Bowl IV. On Saturday, January 24, 1970, Red Little came to work and said that he wasn't feeling well. He had been trying to fight off influenza and a bad head cold for a couple of days. After about an hour I could see that he was really sick and should not have been working. I told him to take the day off, and he tried to talk me into staying, but I told him that I was taking him home. That afternoon, the lady whose home he lived in, called and said that Mr. Little had went to bed, and later on she went to check on him to see how he was feeling, and found that he was dead. She said that he had apparently been getting on the edge of the bed when he died and fell back upon it. I was really shocked to hear this sad news. He was a good old guy and everyone enjoyed having him around. He had a daughter living in California and I notified her of his death. She said that she would not be able to afford the trip back to St. Joseph. Red had no other relatives that I knew of, so I set about making the preparations for his funeral. I told the funeral director that he was without funds, and to keep it simple. They were very helpful, and told me to contact the Social Security people, and that they would pay $250 toward his funeral expense. We were able to give him a pretty decent funeral considering the meager funds that we had to work with. He had made a lot of friends in the downtown area, and over 50 people turned out for the visitation and funeral. He had 2 barbers, 2 bartenders, and 2 bankers, for pallbearers. Some of those in attendance was the mayor of St. Joseph, and a former mayor, a utilities company president, beauticians, doctors, lawyers, optometrist, store owners, commercial artist, and a host of friends. We buried him in the Oddfellows Cemetery, and after the burial the pallbearers and a few other dignitaries, including Yo and I, had a wake in the Pony Barn of the Robidoux Hotel in honor of Sterling Orrin Little. He was 59 years old. Also during this year Billy Frank's dad passed away. Frank Curly Chambers was 82. On February 14, 1970, Greg Arlen Jarrett was born. He was the son of Michael and Sherry Jarrett. In 1970 a 16-ounce can of pork and beans was 11 cents, and sliced bacon was 59 cents a pound. An automatic washer and dryer went for about $300, and a new Ford Falcon for $1,912. If you were really loaded you could own a new Lonkin Mark III for $7,281. On April 18, 1970, a new nephew was born, Kirk Frederick Hines. He was the son of Mervyn and Sherry Hines. The following month on May 4, Kirk's cousin and our son Jimmy Jarrett was inducted into the National Honor Society at Savannah High School. He was finishing up his junior year and looking forward to becoming a senior in the fall. 4 nights later the mixed chorus put on their spring concert and Gary sang with them. He would be a sophomore on Sunday, August 2, 1970, at 6 a.m. We headed out 1-70 for Colorado in our black 1964 hardtop Chevy Malibu. 3.5 hours later we took on 17 gallons of fuel at Salina, Kansas. We were eating our lunch on the run as we passed by the town of Hayes, and at 3 p.m. we arrived at Denver. About 30 miles west of the city, we left 1-70, and headed north on Highway 40 over Berthoud Pass and down to the little village of Winter Park. It was 5:30, and the sun was dropping down behind Byers Mountain when we spied a dude ranch called Idlewild. It had been a long day and we were eager to tie the Malibu up for the night. Lodging for the 4 of us was $20. We ate at a little nearby cafe. Maureen and the boys had fried chicken and I had roast beef. Total cost, $8 plus a 50-cent tip. Don't forget, all prices are for 4 people. Monday morning we had breakfast at the Idlewild and the waitress were cute little high school girls who lived nearby. This was their summer job. They certainly weren't overlooked by the boys. They learned their names and made plans to run around with them when they got off work. Our breakfast cost $4 plus a 50-cent tip. We also ate lunch there and it was the same price as breakfast. After lunch we headed out to climb Byers Mountain. 2 of the girls, Christy Ireland and Diane Dink Hickman, came along with us. When we started our ascent at 2:30 p.m. a light rain began to fall. The girls had to go to work at 6 o'clock, and after climbing to about the halfway point they decided that they had better return or they would be late getting back. Tuesday morning we had a good breakfast for $2.28. And a 50-cent tip, of course. It figured out at 57 cents apiece. We started the climb at 10:55. Jimmy and Gary hooked up with a group of Girl Scouts and they reached the summit in less than 2 hours. Maureen and I came dragging along a half hour later and we all ate our lunch on the summit. During the descent we took our time and rested and played along the way and got back at 4 o'clock. In the evening we drove to the Brookside Motel and dined on ham omelet, German sauerkraut and sausage, and Salisbury steak. We were eating high on the hog. It cost us $7.30 and we left a 25-cent tip. It seemed like the more expensive the meal the smaller we tipped. Before heading back to Idyllwild we gassed up at Hideaway Park for the exorbitant price of $464 per gallon. It was probably about the highest that I had ever paid. Wednesday morning we didn't get up until 10 o'clock. We had breakfast at the motel and then we laid around the pool sunning ourselves. That afternoon Diane, Christy, and Cindy went with us to the St. Louis campgrounds for a picnic. After eating, Jimmy, Gary and the girls drove over to Granby. Maureen and I went over to Fraser to buy groceries after they returned. When we got back, we drove up the mountain to see the old Moffett Railroad Tunnel. While we were there the boys and I climbed down a hillside to see the wreckage of a train that an avalanche took off the tracks decades before. I picked up an old railroad spike, and after many years, it still adorns our W%@naught shelf. That evening Jimmy, Gary, Dink, Christy, and 2 boys named Topper, went for a walk and jog. In the process the sheriff stopped them to see what they were up to. They were still laughing when they got back. Thursday morning we had breakfast at Idyllwild, and was on our way at 11:30. We had a very enjoyable stay there but were starting to have a few pangs of Cosby fever. We stopped on Berthoud Pass and took our first ride on a ski lift. It was fun, but also expensive. It cost $4.50. We hit 1 to 70 and headed east at Denver. We took 1 to 76 for Nebraska. We stopped about 50 miles out of Denver at a watering hole, where we gassed up the Malibu, and dined. We followed along the South Platte, and about 5 miles from the Nebraska border, 1 to 76 became 1 to 80. 20 miles into Nebraska we arrived at Ogallala, a nice little town about the size of Savannah, Mo. We were getting a little road weary and decided to spend the night. We got a room for $18.45, and walked across the street to Hake's Cafe. They had a buffet, so we had veal steak and sliced beef with all the trimmings, for $8.71. The following morning we left Ogallala at 9 a.m. and ate breakfast on the run from our onboard grocery supplies. 7 miles east of Kearney we took Highway 10 south 12 miles to Minden, home of the world-famous Pioneer Village. It was the brainchild of a Chicago manufacturer, Harold Warp. Minden had been his boyhood home and he had went to seek his fortune in the big city. He became the founder and manufacturer of Flexo Glass and Warp Plastics. The collection of Americana spans from 183C to present day. At this point in time there are 22 buildings on 20 acres of land, housing over 30,000 items. We only had time to see a portion of it but planned to return someday and get a motel, and spend some time there. For anyone traveling the Midwest, Pioneer Village is something you should not miss. In the middle of the afternoon we ate lunch in the car and headed back up to 1 to 80. We headed east and when we arrived at Lincoln, the capital of Nebraska, we left the interstate and took Highway 10 over to Nebraska City. We stopped at a Dairy Queen and had ourselves an ice cream cone, then we crossed the Missouri River into Iowa. We headed south on 1 to 29, and Cosby fever was really taking hold of us. We arrived home at 8:15 p.m. August 7, 1970. It was Grandpa Heinz's 65th birthday. In the spring of 1970, brother-in-law Jerry Arnold had been an accountant for the St. Joseph Light and Power Company for 13 years. Computers were in their infancy and his company sent him to training seminars to learn this new and revolutionary technology. He was promoted to supervisor of data processing. He took me on a tour of their new computer. It occupied an entire room and the temperature had to be regulated in order for it to work properly. Little did we know that in a few short years millions of people would own computers the size of a typewriter and some as small as a book. During the summer of 1970 my little sister Mrs. Suzanne Jarrett Arnold threw her hat in the political ring for the office of Buchanan County Recorder. She knew that it would be a long shot considering that Republicans were an endangered species in that county, and her opponent had been the incumbent for the last 40 years. When the dust settled, she had lost, but the Republicans had found someone who was brave enough to risk challenging the opponent. On August 21, 1970, at 1:30 Sunday afternoon, Marine's piano students put on a recital just up the road from our place, at the Bethel Baptist Church. The students were Beth, Nancy, and Danny Heegman. Kane and Jill Kreider, Diane, Sheeran, and Carla Vett, Kathy, and Barbara Thace. In the fall of that year, Jimmy started his senior year of high school, and Gary his sophomore year. They were playing football again, and when his football season ended, wrestling would follow. November 12, 1970, 6 students were selected to compete in an oratorical contest to represent the school in the district competition. Jimmy didn't get it, but we were proud that he was one of the 6 finalists. Jimmy had played freshman football as a 98-pound lineman. He was a rugged little guy, and his coach would get a kick out of watching him battle a lineman twice his size. In freshman ball, Gary played quarterback and was a good one. He could throw long and accurately. He also played cornerback on defense. In the fall of 1970, the Jarrett brothers were both playing on the varsity together as defensive cornerbacks. They both received letters as varsity wrestlers, and their weight divisions were next to one another during the wrestling meets. They were exciting to watch, and their mom and dad did a lot of squirming in the bleachers during their matches. They both excelled in wrestling, and were 4-year lettermen, and they lettered 3 years in football. Marine and I were keeping the road hot, attending athletic and other school activities. It started in junior high and lasted for a total of 8 years, and we enjoyed every minute of it. During the year of 1970, my old friend Ivan Reynolds that I drove the truck for back in the early 50s passed away at the age of 59. Thursday, March 4, 1971 was a big day in Gary's life. He celebrated his 16th birthday and would soon take his driver's examination and become mobile. However, our exuberance was dampened when his mother returned from having an exam at Dr. Kelly's office. He informed her that there was a lump in one of her breasts and that it had to be removed. He scheduled her surgery for the following Monday. When she went into surgery, she had no idea whether or not she would have her breast when she awakened. We were real worried that it might be malignant. I could always tell if things were good or if they were bad by the expression on Doc Kelly's face. When he came into the surgery waiting room with a big smile, I knew before he told me that everything was fine, and it was benign. On Wednesday evening, March 4, 1971, a few women held a meeting at the home of Mrs. Roger Ford. Shirley, the purpose of the meeting was to organize an extension club through the University of Missouri. It was organized, and they placed a limit on the number of members at 20. Maureen received an invitation to become a member from her sister-in-law Sherry Hines. They named it the Friendly 20 Club, and they would meet the first Wednesday of each month at a designated member's home. That member would be responsible for providing the program. Sometimes they would have an interesting guests, and sometimes they would take a tour. At some point in time, they dropped out of the Missouri Extension Club and became a private organization, and the meeting night was changed to the second Wednesday of each month. Down through the years, some members would drop out, but there would always be someone to take their place. Tuesday, April 13, 1971, was a tragic day for my old Marine buddy Logan Beggs and his wife Margie and their children. Their 17-year-old son Dirk Lynn, while riding his motorcycle, collided with a car driven by his high school friend. The scene of the accident was at the intersection of Dewey Avenue and Market Street. Dirk was riding south and his friend was going west when they collided. Dirk was thrown into a tree on the southwest corner of the intersection. He suffered severe head injuries and possible fractures of both wrists and left leg, and possible chest injuries. Margie, who lived a short distance away, was summoned to the scene of the accident and was kneeling over him and holding his hand when the ambulance arrived. He was taken to the Sisters Hospital and then transferred to the Kansas University Medical Center, and listed as very critical. He died the following day. The funeral was scheduled for Friday, April 16. Logan and his son Terry came to my shop at the Robidoux, and I gave them both haircuts. They were devastated, and so was I. I felt helpless to do anything, and the only thing that I could think of at that moment was to insist that I provide my services complimentary. Logan and Margie had lived near Cosby when Dirk was attending elementary school at Helena with Jimmy and Gary. He was attending Lafayette High School in St. Joseph, and was a letterman in football and wrestling. He had a host of young friends. His pallbearers were 3 of his teachers and 3 students. Members of the Lafayette High School varsity wrestling squad were honorary pallbearers. For his visitation and funeral, he was wearing his white letter sweater with his green L on it. It was a very difficult time for everyone. May 4, 1971, Jimmy took Nancy, and Gary took Janine, to the high school prom. It was held at the Frog Hop Ballroom, on the North Belt Highway in St. Joe. They dined at the nearby Shangri-La restaurant. This was the same Motel Ani 5 restaurant that their mom and dad spent a night in while on their honeymoon. On May 15, Jimmy and Gary, and the same 2 girls, along with Kent Snow A., Dan and Linda, had a wiener roast back in our timber. With help from our good neighbor, Jay Wright and his Cutling torch, we converted our old Volkswagen minibus into a cabin. On Thursday, May 20, 1971, we attended Jimmy's high school graduation ceremonies at Savannah. It seemed like those 12 years had simply evaporated. The featured speaker that evening was a young fellow from Chillicothe, Mo. named Jerry Litton. He was a captivating speaker and had everyone's rapt attention. On the way home I told Maureen that we would probably be hearing a lot more about him and that in some point in time he would probably run for an elective office. He had been speaking at various places around northwest Missouri. He and his family were gentlemen farmers, who raised Charolais cattle. Sally Juvie Witherby was married, June 4, 1971, at the First Evangelical Church in St. Joseph, Missouri, to James Craig Dinger Meitinger. Her cousin James Earl Jarrett, that's me, was the soloist, accompanied by Eva Maureen Jarrett. My how time flies, it seems like yesterday when she was a 1-year-old baby back at Aunt Ann and Uncle Cliff's farm near Rosendale, during the war years of 1944. The U.S. Marine Corps was founded on Friday, November 10, 1775, at a place called Tunn's Tavern, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I suppose it was only fitting that the Northwest Missouri Detachment of the Marine Corps League was also founded in a tavern. In the spring of 1971, a few good men including myself, got together at a pub called The Office, at 705 Edmund Street in downtown St. Joseph. The proprietor was Earl Phillips Jr., a World War II and Korean War veteran. This establishment had become a gathering place for old Marines. Featured on the walls was a large Marine emblem and some combat action reproductions. The Marine recruiting office was only a block up the street at the Federal Building, and the recruiters usually dropped by from time to time. I should point out that whenever I refer to Marines, it includes both active duty and former active duty Marines. Once a Marine, always a Marine is the Marine Corps motto, and the only ex-Marines are those with dishonorable or bad conduct discharges. On Friday, May 14, 1971, the Northwest Missouri Detachment of the Marine Corps League received its charter. There were 63 charter members. Friday, June 25, 1971, Maureen and I and our sons left for the Marine Corps League State Convention. It was held at Ozark Village, a hotel, on the Lake of the Ozarks. Robert Swede Swenson and his wife Betty drove their pickup truck down and met us there. We were the first 2 members of our newly chartered detachment to attend a state convention. We had a great time and returned home on Sunday. The following day, on Monday, June 28, we headed out for the beautiful Colorado mountains. We took our tent and camping gear, and set up camp on a crystal clear stream that we had discovered the previous year called St. Louis Creek. It flowed through the St. Louis camp near the town of Fraser. It had been one of President Eisenhower's favorite trout fishing streams and he had fished there on his many trips to Colorado. We hiked mountain trails and bathed in the cold water of the stream. It was cold enough to take our breath away. I kid you not, when we came out of the water we would shiver like a dog excreting peach seeds. We had a very enjoyable vacation and returned the following weekend in time for the July 4th celebration of Independence Day on Sunday. To celebrate the 4th we went by Tom and Beverly Scott's cabin. It was located on what was known as the Cutoff. During the flood of 1952, the wild old Missouri River decided to straighten itself out and in so doing rerouted its course, leaving an oxbow lake. Tom was the fellow that signed me up in the Navy Reserve, back on January 13, 1948. We had not seen each other for several years until he started coming into my shop at the Robidoux Hotel and we resumed our friendship. After eating with the Scots, we journeyed up to the Nottoway River near the tiny town of Nottoway. Swede and Betty Swenson had a cabin on the river and we finished celebrating the 4th with them. During the year of 1971, my old childhood neighbors in Erlon Addition, Emma Tenna, and Simon Peter Pete Hogan, passed away. She was 86, and he was 91 years old. He had taught my Sunday school class at Wesley Methodist Church. I had spent many happy hours at their home in Erlon listening to Pete tell us stories. Those were some of the happiest years of my life. I have never forgotten them. July 31, 1971, something unprecedented in the history of mankind took place. Astronauts David R. Scott and James B. Irwin took a ride in the Moon rover. August 29, 1971, I drove to the Veterans Hospital at Leavenworth, Kansas, to visit my old pal Billy Frank Chambers. He wasn't doing very well, that horrible disease had taken its toll on him. His condition was such, that when I left him I was feeling very sad and depressed. There was nothing that I could do for him but watch him die an inch at a time. We went to Lake Perry on Sunday, September 5 for the Jarrett Labor Day weekend outing. We did some sailing and returned home the same evening. Gary started his junior year of high school, and September 13, Jimmy began at Missouri Western State College. September 25, 1971, Nelson and Janie England became managers of a feed store at Diamond, Missouri. Wednesday, October 6, 1971, Maureen hosted her first Friendly 20 Club at our home. On October 10, 1971, Maureen and I attended an open house on the new campus of Missouri Western State College in St. Joseph, Missouri. The annual Jarrett Wiener Roast was held Saturday evening, October 23, back in our timber. Maureen had spent the day giving piano lessons at our home. Jimmy brought Beth Holt, and Gary brought Jeannie Simpson. At 11 o'clock it started raining. Many of the Jarrett outdoor events were concluded in this manner. However, it never seemed to dampen our spirits, we always persevered. November 7, 1971, Marine students performed a recital, from 1:30 to 3 o'clock, after which we drove over to Troy, Kansas to see Mom and Dad's new home. We went by to see Yo and Shirley. Yo was in the field, picking corn on his farm south of Troy. We visited with Shirley, then came home. On November 14, I took Maureen to the Missouri Methodist Hospital where she was to undergo surgery to remove a tumor from her ovaries. She had been concerned about it for some time, and we three decided that she had better get it done. She shared room 332 East with Kay Beatty, a girl who lived northeast of Savannah. Her husband was Billy Beatty. The following day Dr. Kelly removed a tumor the size of a grapefruit. We were greatly relieved when we found that it was a benign cyst. Maureen said that when she awakened from surgery, it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into her stomach. She and Kay visited all day long and only when they were sleeping did they quit giggling, and when she did giggle her incision hurt but that didn't deter them. She returned home Saturday, November the 20th, fit as a fiddle and happy to be home. We of course were happy to have her home for various reasons. We of course missed her smiling face but we also missed her good home cooking. Maureen grew up living neighbors to Clarence and Pearl Venicole. They had 2 children, Donald and Emma D. Donald was killed during World War II, on December 4, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. My father-in-law Ed Hines told me that Clarence was up to his house visiting when a man pulled into the driveway. He was from the War Department. He said he was looking for Mr. and Mrs. Venicole. Clarence introduced himself and the man told him his son had been killed in action. Ed said that Clarence went home to tell his wife and daughter that their only son and only brother was dead. Emma D. became a registered nurse, and when a farmer, who lived north of Avenue City, severed some fingers in a farm machine, she was his attending nurse at the Missouri Methodist Hospital. The love bug must have struck quickly, and she made sure that none of the other nurses got to take care of him. Lowell D. L. D. Snowden, and Emma D. Venicole were married and had 3 children, Janet, Kent, and Kevin. Kent started to school with Jimmy Jarrett in the 1st grade and they became best friends and went through 12 years of school together. LD built an airstrip and hangar on his farm west of Cosby, just across the Platte River. He owned a 2-place airplane, that I think he acquired around the late 60s. One day he called me, and asked if I would like to fly down to Faucet Mo, a wide place in the road a few miles south of St. Joe. He also said that his airplane wasn't running right and he wanted to have an A&E mechanic take a look at it. It would run all right for a while, but at times the engine would lose RPMs for no apparent reason. So of course I wouldn't pass up the chance of getting to fly even if it meant landing in a cornfield somewhere. We pushed it out of the hangar after a pre-flight check. Seeing that there were no bird nest anywhere on the plane, and that the wings were securely attached etc., we climbed aboard and old LD fired her up. She purred like a kitten, and when he ran the engine up and checked the RPM she hummed like a sewing machine. We lined up on the grass runway and he opened her up full throttle and we started rolling and picking up speed. About 3/4 of the way down the strip there was a slight rise in the surface of the runway. This was the point of no return. Traveling at full throttle takeoff speed, there is no turning back at this point. You have already committed, so to speak. Suddenly LD said she's not doing it. Translation: the RPMs are not sufficient to get us over the fence and small trees looming up just ahead of us. He pulled back on the yoke, putting us in a climbing attitude, but it refused to climb. The end of the runway was rushing up at us at a frightening rate of speed. The stall warning was buzzing because of our nose-up attitude and lack of sufficient speed. I figured that we would pile it up at the end of the runway. Somehow we cleared the trees. But I'm sure that our wheels brushed the treetops. Now we were skimming along the top of the corn in the adjacent field. We were still in a nose-up attitude with the stall warning still buzzing loudly. We were by no means out of the woods, so to speak. As we approached the state road at the end of the cornfield, the tall utility poles loomed up ahead of us. We were slowly gaining altitude, but would we be able to get over the electric wires or would we be forced to pass beneath them? We were approaching them and getting near their level. It would soon be decision time. We passed over them by the skin of our teeth. We made it. That was close. We continued to slowly gain altitude as we maintained a straight course south. Gradually the RPMs increased to normal. I think that the normal cruising R.P.M.S was around 2,200 revs. We eventually attained about 2,000 feet of altitude, and headed for Fawcett. We soon arrived over the airstrip and he sat her down without incident and taxied to the hangar at the end of the runway. The A&E mechanic was also a pilot, and he wanted to take it up to see if he could determine what was causing it to lose RPMs. For some reason LD didn't elect to go with him and asked me if I wanted to ride along. And of course I replied in the affirmative. What sane person would turn down a ride in an airplane that just 20 minutes before had shown a tendency to become earthbound? I'm not sure, but perhaps LD had a cleaning job to do in the restroom. I nearly did back during the takeoff. The mechanic and I once again became airborne. This time without a hitch, she ran as smooth as a 17-jewel watch. This was the puzzling thing, it would come and go without warning. It wasn't long before the revs started to drop off significantly and then it would smooth out again. We landed and he declared that he was baffled as to why it would do that. So we loaded up and took off for Atchison, Kansas to see another mechanic. The RPMs continued to drop off and then pick up again. It wasn't critical as long as it kept us in the air, but at low altitudes it could be fatal. We did not locate anyone at the Amelia Earhart Airport, so we flew up to Rosecrans Field at St. Joe. LD made an appointment to have the fellow go into the engine to find out what was causing the problem. Why we didn't call someone to pick us up and leave the airplane, I don't know. We flew back to Cosby, landed and parked it in the hangar. A few days later he took it to St. Joe and they determined that it had a couple of weak valve springs in the engine. They repaired it and it ran fine. I hadn't had too much fun flying since Buck Cannon and I got lost night flying to Kansas City back in the 50s. On Monday, November 22, 1971, LD called to see if I wanted to fly up to Des Moines, Iowa with him. He had a new 4-place airplane and of course you have probably figured out by now that I have never been K-Town turned down a chance to fly. It was a clear and cool autumn day and the flight was smooth and relaxing. When we were nearing the airport, LD in his slow drawl contacted the airport control tower at Des Moines and this is the way the conversation went. We're just a couple of old country boys out here about 5 miles south of the airport, and we would like to land at your airport. The controller came back advising him what runway to use and other landing instructions. With all of the crackling and static on the radio, neither LD or I could understand what the fast-talking fella was saying. It was extremely hard to sort out, but old LD would not be deterred. He doggedly continued on toward the airport. When the airport came into view, using standard procedure, he put her on the downwind leg of his landing. Then he banked into a left turn for his crosswind leg, and all was going well. I was busy rubbernecking as I always did while flying, especially near an airport. Suddenly I saw an airplane approaching the same runway that we were using. He was on his final leg of his landing. We were approaching the same runway on our crosswind leg, but we were closer to the runway than the other plane. I told LD that there was a plane off to our right who was also approaching our runway. He decided that the other plane was far enough out that we could make it in ahead of him. So he continued on, making a left turn onto his final ahead of the plane that was now behind us, following us in. After landing, we were taxiing up to park when the air traffic controller called us and said, "Did you know that you landed using a left-hand pattern at a right-hand airport?" LD replied, "I sure didn't know that. We use a left-hand pattern in St. Joe." The controller made no reply. However, he didn't write him up. He probably figured that we were a couple of hayseeds from Missouri that didn't know our right from our left. We probably should have had him repeat his radio message until we were sure that we understood what he was saying, but we didn't. He had a new set of tires and wheel covers put on the plane, and we made it home at 3:30 in the afternoon with no hits, no runs, and just few errors. Thanksgiving fell on November 25, in 1971. The Jarrett clan gathered at the home of brother Bud Jarrett and wife Lou, in Atchison, Kansas. The only ones that were absent was Steve and Mike Jarrett. They were in the Navy aboard the Ticonderoga. Nelson and my little sister Janie were living in Diamond, Missouri, running the feed store there. The following morning the boys went to Savannah to attend wrestling practice. That afternoon Jimmy and Kent Snowden fooled around at his house and ate there. Then later Jimmy went to St. Joe to see a girl that he had attended school with at Savannah, Desiree Bloom. Gary went to town with Jeannie Simpson. Her mother was Marion Smith Simpson. Her and Maureen went to school together at Savannah. She was married to Bill Simpson. Maureen gave piano lessons all day, and the Gorwell kids brought their piano teacher a cake. They were Ray and Faye's children. Both of them had went to school with Maureen at Savannah High. They were sweethearts in school and never dated anyone else, and were married after graduating from school. Their children were Terry, Kathy, Timmy, and Jimmy. Terry was Jimmy and Gary's good friend. They played on the Cosby ball team together. The boys were getting grown up and didn't require much supervision, so Maureen decided to look for a job in the city. On Wednesday, December the 1st, she drove into town and applied at the American Family Insurance Company. That evening she and Patty Schottel and Catherine Ford drove to St. Joe for the Friendly 20 Christmas dinner at the Shangri-La. The cost was $2.95 per meal. At that time, my cousin Bill Jarrett and his wife Pam Drowns Jarrett were leasing the restaurant and lounge. In 1971 my folks sold their farm at Clarksdale and purchased a house at Troy, Kansas. On Saturday, December 4, 1971, Jimmy helped Mom and Dad Jarrett move to Troy. Mom and Dad had came full circle. This is where they were married, back in 1922. I worked at the shop, and Gary was in a wrestling meet at Savannah. In the evening we were all up to see the matches. During this period in time, Maureen and I were going to the Eagles Lodge at 2004 North Belt Highway in St. Joseph. We went with John and Wilma Schussler to the Saturday night dances. They featured the Sylvie brothers, who played good old country music. I attended McKinley grade school with their older brother Carl back in the 30s. December 6, 1971, 17-year-old George Byron Garb took his own life with a gun, in his home 2 miles south of Cosby. He had attended school with Jimmy and Gary, through all the grades. He also played ball on the Cosby boys softball team. No one knew why he had become so depressed. It was very sad and a waste of such a young life. December 12th, Maureen and I went to back timber and enjoyed fried sausage and eggs over an open fire. It was the start of something that would be repeated many times down through the years. Steve Jarrett was discharged from the Navy in December of 1971, after serving a 4-year enlistment. It was good to have him back in the family fold again. Christmas Eve of 1971, we journeyed down to Sugar Lake, to Brother Bob and Joyce's home, for the traditional Jarrett Christmas Eve family gathering. All were present except Mike and Sherry Jarrett, and our niece Shelley Arnold. Joyce had to play the organ for their Christmas program church at her church in Atchison, and Maureen went along with her. They weren't gone very long. As always, we had an enjoyable time. New Year's Eve was celebrated at the home of Leonard and Juanita Schussler, John and Wilma's oldest son. This became a tradition that lasted for several years. During the course of the evening we would usually stop by 2 or 3 parties. Gary took Jeanla Simpson, and Jimmy took a girl named Pam. After leaving the Schusslers we went over to Sweet and Betty Swenson's for another party and breakfast with my Marine Luddies. We made it home. At 4:30 a.m. New Year's Day we ate dinner at Mom and Dad Hines. Mervyn Hines and family were there, and also Maureen's Uncle Raymond and Aunt Georgie Hines. In the evening we went to Troy to celebrate Mom's 75th birthday. It turned out to be a long day, but a most enjoyable one. We sure slept good when we got home. My brother Yo and his wife Shirley purchased the Windsor Hardware store in Troy. They opened it on Monday, January 3, 1972. Dad planned to help him out around the store, and Shirley was still working as a registered nurse. January 6, 1972, Maureen took a typing test at American Family Insurance while seeking employment there. She also applied at the Missouri State Hospital No. 2. On Sunday, January 9, Emma D. called and invited us to fly down to Springfield, Missouri with them to get a bite to eat. They had traded their airplane for a 4-passenger one. And you already know the obvious answer to her invitation. It goes without saying, I couldn't think of anything that I would rather be doing on such a beautiful winter day. After checking out the airplane and looking for birds' nest under the engine cowling, we took off from the Snowden airstrip at 11 a.m. It was 51 degrees as we flew into a beautiful crisp blue sky. I believe we climbed to about 2,000 feet. You could see out across the countryside for miles. Our destination was about a 2-hour flight. As we flew over Missouri City, a suburb on the east border of Kansas City, we saw an unusual sight. There was a large smokestack, and we could look directly down into it. LD was in the pilot seat on the left, and I was in the co-pilot seat at his right. I think he felt more comfortable knowing that he had a backup pilot if the need should arise. Maureen and MD occupied the 2 rear seats. We arrived at Springfield at 1 p.m. It had been a beautiful flight. We had a delicious dinner at the airport restaurant. We left for the Cosby Metropolitan Airport at 3 p.m. and arrived at 5 o'clock. It had been a picture-perfect day for flying. Jimmy, Gary, and Kent just fooled around together that day, and probably talked about girls. It had become their favorite subject, and they dwelt on it most of the time. It had been an enjoyable and memorable trip for the 4 of us. We vowed to do it again sometime, but as you will see, that sometime never came again. On January 19, 1972, Maureen stopped by the Phillips Roxanne Company to apply for a job. They were located at 2621 North Belt Highway in St. Joseph. They were an international Holland-Dutch corporation that besides animal health products owned Philips Electronics. She was told by the personal director to come by the following day for an interview. The next day Dr. Charles Purdy, a director in the Research and Development Department, interviewed her. He must have saw some potential and stability in her because he hired her on the spot. She went to work the following day in the R&D lab. That first day she drew blood from a dog's vein without hesitation. She says that she missed a couple of days because of sickness during the 21 years that she was there, but I sure don't recall it. She loved the work and became lifelong friends with several of her fellow employees. If you will recall, back in 1960 when I was working on bridge construction with Jimmy Wiedmeyer, I left construction to go to Barber College. I afraid that Jimmy would remain in heavy construction and that it would be the biggest mistake of his life. On February 26, 1972, Jimmy was employed for Direcco Incorporated of St. Joseph. He was working on a job at Grandview Mo, a suburb of Kansas City. A crane boom crashed down on him, and witnesses at the scene of the accident told police the crane was not operating at the time of the accident and could give no reason for the accident. He was pinned beneath tons of steel. They notified his family that he had been in an accident, and the first reports were that he had a broken leg. That was the least thing wrong with him. His body was crushed so badly that he died en route to the hospital. He was 31 years of age and was survived by his wife, Patricia, Quinby, Wiedmeyer, and his children, James Allen, Richard Wayne, and Lori Ann. Also his brothers Francis, Wilfred, Edwin, Robert, Ronald, Gilbert Jr., Donald, and sisters, Mrs. Aloy Haverkamp, Janet, Mrs. William E. Fleiderer, Yvonne, Mrs. Fred Garton, Nancy, Diane Wiedmeyer, and his parents Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert M. Sr., and a host of relatives and friends, including myself. The Reverend Howard E. Tubach, the preacher who performed our wedding, passed away March 24, 1972. April 6, 1972, Maureen and I celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary. I bought her a gold wedding band. She had always wanted one to wear for every day so that she could save her diamond for special occasions. On that same day, Jimmy and Gary helped Janie and Nelson move from Diamond Mo to Wethena, Kansas. April 11, 1972, Philip Buddy Tall, my friend and former shoe shiner, passed away at the age of 33. He had served in the Army performing occupation duty in Korea. He probably climbed some of the same hills that my feet had trod some 20 years earlier. He was a good man and a good friend. I served as a pallbearer at his funeral that was conducted at the Alexander Funeral Home. On Wednesday, April 12, 1972, Jerry and Suzanne Arnold opened Arnold's Grocery, at Clarksdale, Missouri. Jerry would continue a family tradition in Clarksdale, Missouri, that began with his grandfather and continued on by his father. On Monday, April 17, 1972, the boys and I tore down the old cabin that had sat in our barn lot. Albert Miller, the man that we bought our farm from, had rented a farm that joined onto this place. He and his wife Nellie, and 5-year-old daughter Dorothy, moved from that farm to our place in 1918. In later years, Dorothy told me that they moved their belongings in a horse-drawn wagon, up through the field. Albert's bachelor brother Joe lived with them. When they moved, Joe moved into a cabin over on the west side of the farm near the spring. It is not known whether he built the cabin, or if it was already there. He lived in the cabin until his death in 1938, and it was probably at that time that they moved it to the barn lot where it was used many years for a corn crib. We continued to use it for that purpose after we acquired the farm. Jimmy and Gary had decided that it would make a nice cabin to replace the cramped-up little Volkswagen cabin. We first removed the dilapidated roof, siding, and floor. Next we removed the studs, rafters, and stringers, and numbered each one as they were removed. We hauled them to the timber where the old Volkswagen bus had been setting. We had deposited it in a ditch, about 100 yards to the northwest of the site. Later a bulldozer flattened it, and pushed it in the ditch and covered it up. For a foundation we stacked a row of cement blocks at the back and 3 rows in front. We used pine 2x4s for the floor joist and covered it with plywood sheets. We assembled the framework using the old mill sawed oak studs and the walnut rafters and stringers, from the original cabin. They were full 2x4s. We used white pine on the sides, and used some windows that we had scrounged up. We put batten insulation in the walls and covered them with some old paneling that we had come up with. I had purchased some windows that rolled out, and a door and an old gas heater from one of my clients at the Robidoux barbershop. The windows were built in the early 40s and were still in the original crates. The man's name was Carl Gocher. He had been a control tower operator at Rosecrans Airport in St. Joe. We put a plywood roof on it and covered it with asphalt shingles. We slapped some paint on the siding and called it good. We put an old cabinet and sink in that had once belonged to cousin Loris and Murray Witherby. And then we laid a tile drain. We used an old cabinet that nephew Mike Jarrett had removed from a trailer house. We put in an old wood-burning stove, and also the gas heating stove. We later built a 93-foot swinging bridge that spanned the stream that we had to cross to reach the cabin. We also built a bridge that we dubbed the T&A Bridge. Tractor and auto. It crossed the creek and followed an old wagon trail a couple of 100 feet up to the cabin. The reason that I am going into so much detail about our cabin is because it would be the centerpiece of so many functions in the ensuing years. It was one of our better ideas and one that we would enjoy for many years to come. In the evening of April 1, 1972, we attended a meeting at Savannah High. Gary followed in his brother's footsteps by being inducted into the National Honor Society. This year we had to dispense with a vacation because of Maureen's new job, but we would look forward to next year. On May 6, of 72, Jimmy and Gary helped Aunt Janie and Uncle Sod, Nelson, England, load up their belongings, for another move back to Diamond. They helped them load up but did not make the trip with them. That same afternoon, Gary was at the Hotel Robidoux, helping decorate the banquet room for the Savannah High School prom. That evening he was Jeannie Simpson's escort to the prom. The following morning the boys returned to help clean up the banquet hall at the hotel. Friday, June 21st, Maureen and I headed south in our 1969 Plymouth Fury. We had owned this car since about 1971, and it was a former highway patrol car. It was powered by a 440-inch 3 engine and would pass everything but a gas station. We were on our way to Diamond, Missouri to visit Janie and Nelson. The town was located on Highway 71, just below Joplin. The population was a little under 1,000. We visited with them and little Angie and Jennifer. We stayed the night at the nearby Stevens Motel. The following morning we ate at the truck stop where Janie worked as a waitress. She came up and visited with us, and we bid her farewell and headed down to Granby, a town about 20 miles to the southeast of Diamond. This was the home of old boot camp buddy, Richard G. Smith. I hadn't seen or heard from him since he and I went on liberty back in Oakland, California in 1951. The little town was nestled in the Ozark Hills. When we arrived at the outer edge of town we stopped at a service station to inquire about Richard. After the passage of 20 years I wondered if he was still in this area. I asked the station attendant if he knew of his whereabouts. He studied for a mop.ent and hollered at a man that was filling gasoline storage tanks nearby. He asked the fellow if he knew where Richard Smith lived. And the answer that he gave was a real shocker. He said Richard had been killed in a car wreck the previous year. I asked if his mother or any family members were still living here. The man told me that his mother and his family were still in Granby. He directed us to their homes. We met his mother and also his son and daughter. They were young adults and we had a nice visit with them. Richard's mother told us that down through the years he had to have surgery for his war wounds. And they were performed back in Pennsylvania. He had worked as a commercial artist in Joplin and commuted between the two towns. Last year he was on his way home when he missed a curve and was killed. My old friend had went through hell from the wounds he received back in Korea. And still survived only to die in a car wreck. I felt sad and also guilty that I had not contacted him in 20 years. And now he was gone. We bid his family farewell and headed out for Silver Dollar City. We arrived there at 11 a.m. A man was selling rides in his helicopter for $3 a head. It was a pretty hefty price, but we said what the heck, let's do it. It was as much fun as I had imagined it would be when I was watching choppers shuttling the wounded boys back to the rear with the gear in Korea. We arrived at Joy and Lois Smith Grable's at 6 p.m. and had supper with them. They lived in the little town of Hollister. Their home and 4 or 5 cabins were situated on a hillside that led up to the town. We ate supper with them and rented one of their cabins for the night. Lois was Morin's first cousin and a sister to Billy Doyle Smith, who was killed in Korea. Joy Ellis Grable was the uncle of Ann Henderson, my next-door neighbor at the Robidoux barber shop. Joy was born and raised in the little town of Agency, just to the south of St. Joe. He had several brothers and sisters, and his dad was the town blacksmith. Ann said that she learned to cuss hanging out in her grandpa's blacksmith shop with her Uncle Joy, who was 2 years her senior. Tootie, Lois, was born in Cosby and spent a part of her childhood there. She and her brother Billy Doyle played with Maureen when they were kids. Joy was inducted into the Army and served in Korea with an artillery outfit. When he returned home from the Army, he and Lois were married and moved to California in 1957. He worked into the heavy construction industry and moved around the state quite a lot. They finally settled down in Norco and lived there for a number of years. Wonder of wonders, they lived on Reservoir Street, and so did my first cousin Leo Slater. They drove by one another's house every day for several years. We eventually noticed that they lived on the same street and told them about it, and they stopped by and became acquainted with Leo and Juanita. They lived in California for 18 years and decided that they were tired of the rat race there, so they moved back to Missouri. They settled in the little town of Hollister that bordered the south side of Branson. The following morning we bid the Grables farewell and headed out, stopping in Branson for breakfast. At the little town of Collins, About 50 miles north of Springfield, we pulled up to the four-way stop at the crossroads of Highways 13 and 54. The engine died and the Plymouth refused to go any further. We were fortunate to find a mechanic on Sunday. He had a little old garage that was pretty hard looking, but we couldn't be choosy. He examined our car and proclaimed that we needed a timing chain, a procedure that required major engine work, and we would have to leave it. I called the boys and asked them to come to Mom and Dad's rescue. It was about 6 hours round trip to where we were. We arrived home at 8 p.m. that evening. We had a 2 inches rain and thunderstorm that put out the lights. The next day was July 24th, Jimmy's 19th birthday, and I was fed up with the big gas guzzler, so the boys and I went shopping for a new car. On Wednesday, July 26th, I boarded a bus for Collins at 3:30. When I arrived, I looked to get a good skinning from my newfound mechanic. However, I was pleasantly surprised. I guess there are still a few honest people around. He only charged me $75 and I thought that it would probably be twice that much. I thanked him for such quick and reasonable service and was on my way. I arrived home at midnight, ready for some much-needed rest. On Friday, July 28th, the American National Bank, former Tootle Enright Bank, and I acquired a new 1972 Toyota Celica. The dealership was on the Belt Highway in St. Joe. It was the first year that Toyota produced the sporty Celica. It was a crystal blue 2-door coupe with a black vinyl top. It had a 2000cc 4-cylinder engine, a standard shift on the console, bucket seats, tachometer, trip speedometer, front disc power brakes, rear window defroster, radio, clock, and wheel covers. It was a beauty, and ran and handled like an Indy racer. It set us back $3,093.95. I don't recall how much they allowed us for the Plymouth, but I was relieved to unload that gasaholic to a new owner. This car would turn out to be one of the finest cars that we ever owned. Jerry and Suzanne Arnold moved back to their former hometown of Clarksdale. Business at the store was thriving, and I think that they were happy to be back home. November 23rd, we had the Jarrett Thanksgiving at our house. There were 32 in attendance. Mac Jarrett stayed all night with Jimmy and Gary at the cabin. On November 29, 1972, Dr. Kelly operated on Maureen to remove a cyst from her breast. She was a very worried girl and would not know until she awakened from surgery, whether or not the tumor was malignant, and if she would still have her breast. She was not the only one worried. The boys and I were also sweating out the results of the surgery. When Doc Kelly came to the waiting room, he had a smile on his face, and we knew everything was all right. The following morning I came over from the shop and took her home. Mom and Dad Hines brought a cake up in the afternoon and visited a while. That evening we were all at home and happy to be together, and thankful that she had made it safely through the ordeal. On December 16, 1972, Morin's company Christmas party was held at the Robidoux Hotel. We attended and had a good time. The Jarrett clan had Christmas Eve over at Troy, Kansas at Mom and Dad Jarrett's. We also celebrated their golden wedding anniversary and Suzanne and Jerry Arnold's 20th anniversary. Maureen and I had New Year's Eve in St. Joe, at the American Legion Post 359, and then to Lenny Schussler's party. January 9, 1973, Jimmy went to work in the lab of Rockwell International Foundry at Atchison. He would be burning his candle at both ends before he was through. He had a tough schedule in the science department at Missouri Western. He lived here at home and worked nights at Atchison. On February 5, Gary, having reached the age of 18 the previous day, complied with the federal law by registering for the military draft. February 21, 1973, we went to the Brame Funeral Home to visitation for Billy Frank's brother Robert Chambers. Bob passed away at the Veterans Hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, from complications from Huntington's chorea. He had spent the last 10 years of his life there. He died a lonely man, far from his family and friends. We got to visit with Milton Lee Chambers, and Sally Chambers Brown, and Billy Frank's daughters, Julie, Linda, Susie, and Dorothy. By this time Milton Lee was nearly ravished from Huntington's chorea. March 19, 1973, the show Brigadoon was being performed at Savannah High and Gary had the leading role. The audience was loaded with Gary's kinfolk. Some of those in attendance besides his mom and dad were Grandpa and Grandma Jarrett, Uncle Bud, and Aunt Luvina, Uncle Yo, and Aunt Shirley, Uncle Mert, Aunt Sherry and Leslie Hines. Our niece Shelley Arnold rode along with us. Gary's mom and dad liked it so well that we went again the following night. But if Gar had not been in it, we probably wouldn't have went at all. Jimmy and Gary were constantly on the go. The Jarrett Ranch was a busy place during those years. The following is a list in alphabetical order of some of their regular friends that I can recall. Cousin Shelley Arnold, Joe Carr, Dean Cornelius, Janet Dixon, Beth Holt, Steve Jarrett, Beverly Keller, Connie McManus, Steve Oakes, Tana Powell, Kim Salmons, Robbie Sample, Carrie Schneider, Jeannie Simpson, Kent Snowden, Carla, Diane, and Sharon Vett, and Steve Woodward. On February 5, the pressure became too much for Jimmy. He had to quit his job in Atchison. 1973 was a rainy year. A mile to the east of us, the third fork of the Platte River was out of its banks several times. The trail back to the cabin was a mud waller, and Jimmy and Gary, along with Steve Woodward, Steve Ish, and Joe Carr, had a time of it trying to get back and forth to the cabin. March 27, 1973, Maureen and I went to Savannah to see Gary inducted into the National Honor Society. He was following in his brother's footsteps. We were quite proud of him. Our sons must have inherited their scholastic genes from an ancestor farther removed than their father. April 9, we had a snow blizzard with 20 to 50 miles per hour winds. The temperature was 26 degrees. It was the worst driving conditions that we had all winter, and school let out right after lunch. That evening Jimmy, Gary, Ox, Steve Oakes, Harry, Steve Woodward, were here for supper. There was seldom a day that we didn't have dinner guest, but that was the way we liked it. We enjoyed having the gang here, and there was never a dull moment. Robert Lester Jarrett Jr. and Janice Minter were married on Friday evening, April 27, 1973, at the Wyatt Park Baptist Church in St. Joe. A reception was held at the Moelah Temple. Nearly all of the Jarrett clan attended, with the exception of our son Gary. He had to travel to Columbia, Missouri to sing in a madrigal in the state competition. They received a 1 rating. The following evening Maureen and I visited in St. Joe, with Willie and Lucille Ridings. He ran the shoeshine concession and my barber shop. Lucille was an excellent cook and served some delicious cake. Willie had been employed several years in the packing industry. When they closed the packing houses, several hundred employees were left without jobs. He stayed on with me for more years than anyone that preceded him. At this point in time Willie was 67 years of age and Lucille was 63. They were two of the nicest people that I have had the privilege of calling my friends. Willie served in the Army and the European campaign during World War II. Incidentally, they were a black couple. On Saturday, May 5, 1973, Gary attended the senior prom at the Hotel Robidoux. Gary graduated from Savannah High School on May 20th. Jimmy got a job on May 24th, working at the Casey Myers Ford dealership in St. Joe. He manned a broom and shagged cars, and was a general handyman. Gary was doing farm work for Janet's dad, Carlton Dixon. Jimmy and Gary both worked at various places during their college years. During the fall and winter they cut firewood and I was their sales representative. I had a sign in my shop, advertising for them. They also bucked bales during the hay season, for various farmers in the area. They did this kind of work before they were big enough to lift a bale. Back when they scooted them around on the hay wagon for their Grandpa Hines. On Friday, May 25th, the boys went over to Kansas to Lake Perry. The purpose of the trip was to stake out a claim on a good camping location before the masses arrived. The following day the Jarrett clan arrived in force. And just like on K, it began to rain, lightning, and blow. We gathered under Brother Bob's one-man operation tent, in a futile attempt to keep dry. It was advertised to be a one-man operation to erect but usually required about a half dozen. It was a family joke for many camping seasons. It rained the entire Memorial Day weekend, but it didn't dampen our spirits. Actually, we came to expect rain during both our spring and autumn outings. It was a little uncomfortable, but we loved the camaraderie of family and friends. Those were the days that would soon be gone, and we would look back on them with fond and cherished memories. On Friday, June 22, 1973, we left for the Marine Corps League State Convention at Steelville, Missouri. The facility was located in a beautiful setting out in the woods. I was initiated into the Military Order of Devil Dogs. This is the elite order of the Marine Corps League. Wednesday, June 22, our little dog Candy disappeared. She was about 13 years old, and the previous day she had walked back to the cabin. She had been very wobbly, and we knew that her end was near. We looked all over the farm for her body but never found her. It was around this time that I got Sarge, a beautiful white German Shepherd. On July 12, 1973, one of our kids, Dean Cornelius, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and headed for San Diego. He must have heard me tell too many stories about the Marine Corps and had to find out for himself. July 24, Jimmy was no longer a teenager. His mom fixed a feast for his birthday dinner. Steak, mashed potatoes and gravy, tomato salad, hot rolls, lemonade, homemade German chocolate cake with ice cream. He was dating his Uncle Bud's stepdaughter, Lila Tencel, and Gary was dating Janet Dixon. On July 27, 1973, Gary left on a week-long fishing trip to Minnesota with the Dixons. The following morning, Maureen and I left on a vacation trip on Saturday, July 28, at 8 o'clock. We arrived in St. Louis at about 2 p.m. We rode to the top of the gateway to the West Arch, and Maureen didn't even get claustrophobia in the cramped quarters of the cars that carried us to the top. It was a spectacular view from our lofty perch. We left the big city and arrived at Carlisle, Illinois. That evening we dined at the Hi-Ho restaurant and stayed the night in the Carlisle Motel. We left there at 9 o'clock and stopped for dinner at Paducah, Kentucky. We stopped that evening at Harriman, Tennessee, and spent the night at the Holiday Inn. We drove past the nearby famous Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where a lot of atomic research had taken place. We left there at 9 o'clock and arrived at Cosby, Tennessee. In the Smoky Mountain National Park at 10:30 p.m. we pitched our little nylon pup tent in the park. We had just climbed into our sleeping bags when we heard the garbage cans rattling. At first I couldn't figure out who or why anyone would be fooling around at night. We hadn't seen anyone else in the park. Suddenly it dawned on me. It was those four-legged cuddly creatures with large teeth and big paws with claws on them. The bears had came down from the hills for supper, and we were sleeping in their dining room. We were sure hoping that they weren't looking for a hot meal. I must admit, I had a little trouble getting to sleep. I could almost feel a big old bear breathing on our flimsy little pup tent. It wasn't a real restful night. When morning arrived, we gathered up our tent and toured Cosby. We mailed a card from the post office so that we would have a postmark from Cosby, Tennessee. We drove about 15 miles to the southwest to Gatlinburg, where we made a quick tour of the town. It didn't take long, the population was about 3,000. From there we traveled about 3 staggers and a fall to Pigeon Forge. Here we spent a memorable night of good shut-eye. Our cabin was beside a picturesque stream. The next day was Wednesday, August 1, 1973, we left during a downpour. We were both starting to come down with that old Cosby fever, and I don't mean Cosby, Tennessee. During the day we passed through Knoxville, Lexington, Louisville, Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield, Illinois, where we dined. We hit the road and I didn't let up on that speedy silica until we pulled into our driveway at 1:30 a.m. the following morning on August 4. I saw our neighbor Melvin Bunce come flying over the hill in his pickup truck. I had never seen him drive that fast. I told Maureen that something is wrong somewhere. News travels fast in a small community. His sister-in-law Catherine Bunce had called him and said that her husband Loren had been mowing with a brush cutter in one of their farm pastures a couple of miles from their home, and had failed to come home for lunch. She drove over to check on him and found him crushed under his overturned tractor. That was where Melvin was going when he passed our house. Loren probably died instantly. That afternoon Maureen and I went over to look at the site of the accident. It was about a mile northeast of us. While we were there, a swarm of bumblebees were buzzing around the area where he had overturned. His tractor wheel had ran over a stump, causing it to overturn. However, I have been on a tractor when I ran through a nest of bumblebees, and the natural reaction is to forget about where the tractor is going to fight off the attackers. No one will probably ever know for sure what precipitated this tragedy, but I believe that it is within the realm of possibility that he was distracted by the swarming bees. Loren grew up in the Cosby community and was an Army veteran of World War II. He was well liked and admired by his neighbors and friends. He will certainly be missed. The following day Gary returned from the Minnesota fishing trip. He brought home a large frozen fish that he caught August 11, 1973. Jimmy and Gary left for Colorado on a vacation trip. They were driving Jimmy's 1969 Toyota four-door sedan. Gary also had a '69 Toyota Club Coupe. Jimmy had quit his job at Casey Myers Ford and thought he might try to go back. But first things first, they were in need of a vacation. It was a hassle getting them on the road. They were loaded down with camping equipment. That same evening Maureen and I went to Kansas City, with my cousin Bill, Billy Lynn, and Connie Jarrett. The following day we attended a picnic at Mom and Dad Hines' home. They were having it for Aunt Verna Hines. She was back for a visit from New York. Aunt Pauline and Uncle James Walker, and Uncle Raymond, and Aunt Georgia Hines were also there. Wednesday, August 15th, the boys returned from their trip. They had a great time out in the mountains. On August 19th, John and Wilma Schussler and Maureen and I went to the Starlight Theater in Kansas City to hear the singer Gordon MacRae. At this point in time he was a popular singer. It was a good show, and the star-spangled sky made a beautiful roof for the outdoor theater. Every summer around August the 15th, Jimmy's hay fever usually began. It wasn't a fun time for him, nor for those around him. Wednesday, August 22, 1973, the boys enrolled at Missouri Western State College. This would be Gary's freshman year, and Jimmy would be a sophomore. And once again they would be attending school together. Jimmy's major would be biology, with a minor in chemistry. He was sort of considering a medical career like his friend Kent Snowden, who was at Missouri University. Gary's major would be vocal music. The music bug had bitten him when he did the musical Brigadoon. He would probably go into teaching. On this same day, Steve Oxoaks ran his Ford Bronco into a tree on the Northeast Parkway in St. Joe. He received a serious injury to his eye socket, cheekbone, and forehead. Jimmy and Gar, and Janet Dixon and her sister and brother-in-law, Gail and Glenn Fankhauser, visited him at the hospital. He has scars and an indenture that he will carry the rest of his life. We had our usual Jarrett family assembly at Lake Perry during the Labor Day weekend. On September 5, 1973, we were building a 93-foot swinging bridge across the creek to the cabin. September 15, 1973, Jimmy and Gary worked in the tobacco harvest with Steve and Mike Jarrett on their stepdad, Cohen Marshall's farm. He and Renier had lived a number of years on a farm southeast of Dearborn, Mo. September 25, the boys started moving things back to the cabin in preparation for living back there. Saturday, October 20, 1973, my niece Shelley Arnold came by the shop at the Robidoux and rode home with me. This was the night of the big Jarrett Wiener roast back at the cabin. This had also become a tradition. It was a beautiful autumn evening when we gathered back in the woods for a night of revelry and camaraderie. Mom and Dad Jarrett, and all of the following Jarretts and their kids, Bob and Joyce, Bud and Lou, Lou's daughter Lila Tinsel, Steve, Mike, and Sherry Jarrett, Suzanne, and Jerry Arnold, Shelley, Tim, Joe, and John Arnold, Yo, and Shirley, Mac, Jay, Tina, Jill Jarrett, Janie Jarrett England, Steve OCSE, Janet Dixon, Glenn, and Gail Fankhauser. 2 nights later we had Mom and Dad Hines, Mervyn, and Sherry Hines, and children Leslie and Kirk. Leslie baked a cake and brought it along. Thursday, October 25th, Maureen's birthday, she was 43 years old. We rode to work together and I picked her up after work. Her co-workers had a cake for her and Elaine Stiegel and Shirley Ford bought her a necklace. Wilma and John Schussler had a birthday supper for her at their house. That evening we all watched the movie on TV, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? November 22, 1973, the Jarrett clan gathered at Bob and Joyce Jarrett's, at Lewis and Clark Village on Sugar Lake. The weather was so mild that some of us ate outdoors on a picnic table. There were 4 families that did not attend. My 2 sisters and their families, Suzanne and Jerry Arnold, Janie, and Nelson England, and 2 nephews and their families Mike and Sherry Jarrett, and Bobby and Janice Jarrett. We spent New Year's Eve with our friends the Schuslers, and the next day a record low was recorded for that date, -11 degrees. I cut wood in the timber that afternoon. The following day, January 2nd, Uncle Glenn Roberts passed away at the age of 69. He had contracted emphysema from too many years of smoking cigarettes. 2 days later we attended his funeral, after which the family gathered at Aunt Lou Verne's home. He retired after having served many years as a St. Joseph police officer. On January 9th, it was -6 degrees, and snowed 4 inches. That same day my old flying buddy, LD Snowden, went into the hospital for some tests. The first 2 weeks of January was extremely cold. On the 12th, it set another record low of -24 degrees for this date. The following day it was -22 degrees and we weren't out of it yet. We just hunkered down in our living room to watch the Miami Dolphins defeat the Minnesota Vikings in the Super Bowl IX. This kind of weather was certainly no surprise to us, we were just experiencing typical Missouri weather. It's always been said, if you're not happy with Missouri weather, just stick around for a day or so and it will probably change. And sure enough, the following day the sun was shining bright and it was back up to 40 degrees. But do you know what? I wouldn't trade it for any place else that I have ever been. The road going back to the cabin was a muddy mess, and the boys' gas-operated refrigerator quit working. They were tired of lugging the 10-gallon water can back there and getting stuck about every day. On the 23rd of January the boys had all they could take and moved back in with Mom and Dad, where it was somewhat warmer. But not much. LD Snowden became sick between Christmas and New Year's, and had the symptoms of flu. When January passed and part of February, he was still ailing and they decided to head up to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. They found that he had a very rare hereditary disease called Wilson's disease, hepatolenticeter degeneration. He was only the 13th known case in America. He returned home on February 18th. And the following day he checked into the Kansas University Medical Center in Kansas City, Kansas. His health was deteriorating and they were having no success treating it. On March 4, 1974, during the early morning hours, we were rudely awakened from our slumber when Gary shouted, "The house is on fire." When my eyes popped open the first thing I saw was a red glow in our kitchen. From that point on it was pandemonium. The boys burst out of their room and immediately grabbed a container and started throwing water on the television set that adorned our kitchen table. An instant later Maureen and I made a run for the kitchen. Now I don't usually tell everybody this, but I suppose that I will let a few of you in on my secret if you promise not to tell anyone. I usually sleep in my birthday suit. I suppose that after Korea, I never wanted to sleep with my clothes on again, not even skivvies. I came roaring into the kitchen and when my bare feet hit the wet linoleum that the boys had just doused with water, my toes nearly touched the ceiling, and I came crashing down on my bare butt. From the moment that Gar started fighting the fire, he repeated the same naughty word with each bucket of Vader that he threw on it. It was one that his mother had never heard him say before. But he didn't realize he was saying it. Our bucket brigade soon extinguished the fire and our adrenaline had returned to normal. When the boys noticed my firefighting apparel they went into a fit of laughter. And I knew then that I would have to carry that burden the rest of my life. We were experiencing a spring thunderstorm in late winter. It was raining, hailing, and lightning, and I headed for the barn to get a ladder. I climbed into the attic to make sure the wiring had not started a fire up there. All seemed well, so I came back down. It goes without saying, the only sleep that we got that night was what took place before the fire. We were very fortunate that Gar woke up when he did. The thick toxic smoke from the burning plastic television set was just above our heads when we awakened and stood up. Had it reached us as we slept, we would all have been asphyxiated. We were also fortunate that the bolt of lightning that started the fire also kicked off the breaker switch. Otherwise we would have all been electrocuted. Our home is 18 miles from the Savannah Fire Station and any fire in this area would be out of control by the time they could respond. I wished that somehow we could have a fire department in our area of the county. The following day our insurance adjuster came out to assess the damage. Basically the only damage was a little browning on the wall panel where the TV was setting. There was a great deal of black smoke damage to the walls, ceilings and drapes. The following day the cleaners came out and it took them a couple of days to clean up the mess. A few days later Marvin Young came by collecting money for road gravel. His dad before him used to do that. As usual I donated some money, but I still thought that there must be a more equitable way of financing rock for our roads. March 16, 1974, Sherry Jarrett, wife of Michael Terry Jarrett, gave birth to Jason Michael Jarrett, the grandson of Donald V. Bud Jarrett, and of Lorene Rennie Marshall. L.D. Snowden was back in the hospital on March 13. He had some new doctors and they are running more tests, but they couldn't seem to help him. On the 29th of March, we visited him at the Sisters Hospital in St. Joe, and he said he was feeling great. He was discharged and about 2 weeks later he was back in again. April 11, 1974, Joe Carr would not be deterred by the mud back at the cabin. He moved in and set up housekeeping. He was working for Phillips Roxanne on their farm west of Cosby. This was where they kept their large animals that were used for research. Joe was also attending college at Missouri Western. On April the 15th, our big elm tree that stood beside our back door had to be cut down. It had succumbed to the Dutch elm disease that was plaguing the countryside. A professional tree outfit dropped it for us, and I counted 125-year rings on it. It sprouted in 1849, the year my great-grandpa Slater chiseled his name on Independence Rock on his way to the gold rush. We sure hated to see it go. It provided a great deal of slade for us and it was like losing an old friend. On April 25, 1974, my friend and old flying buddy, L.D. Snowden, lost his battle for his life. The following evening after work I stopped by Mayor Hoffer Funeral Home to see him. We attended his funeral on Saturday afternoon, April 27. It was pretty sad and depressing. It would be tough on Emma D. with the large farming operation to oversee or dispose of. And she had 13-year-old Kevin Dean to raise without a dad. Kent was 22 and attending the University of Missouri, studying medicine. Janet was the oldest at 25, and was married to Gary Watts September 4, 1971. On Sunday evening, the day after the funeral, Marine WRMT over for a visit with Emma D. His illness had a short duration and his death was a shock to everyone. The county had better hurry up and get some rock on our road. A car got stuck in a sinkhole over to the west of us, right in the middle of the road. He was trying to get up Stagner's Hill. It's like the old days when nearly all of the country roads were pure mud when it rained. On Friday afternoon at 3 p.m., May 3, 1974, we left on vacation. Our destination was south of the border to Monterrey, Mexico, via Arlington and San Antonio, Texas. We took the Kansas Turnpike in our little Toyota Celica. It was still a pleasure to drive. All of the way down the interstate I entertained Maureen by quoting some of my old Earl limericks. She was amazed that after so many years, I -3 still remember the naughty little poems that I learned as a little boy. I've always said that I earned my Ph.D. in orneriness, at the foot of the masters, i.e. my big brothers and their pals. And like an elephant, I never forget the important things. We stopped for the night 50 miles into Oklahoma at the little town of Perry. The total for supper was $2.50, and breakfast was $3.18. Lodging was $15.40. Saturday we headed down to Arlington and arrived at Bill and Shirley Herzog's at 2 p.m. We ate supper with them, then went over to visit Maureen's cousin, Melvin and Doris Hines, and their daughter Cindy. We had a great time that evening barbecuing chicken in Herc's backyard. We spent the night with them. And at midday we bid the Herzogs adieu, and left Arlington during a downpour. We arrived at a bright and sunny San Antonio at 4:30. We got a room at the Ramada Inn, and called Maureen's cousin Phyllis and Dan Mathers. She invited us over for supper. We had a delicious meal and they took us on a tour of the town. We got to see the gondolas meandering through the heart of the city on the San Antonio River. We also got to see a part of history when we visited the Alamo. We bid Dan, Phyllis, and their little girls Kathy and Christine farewell, and we got back to our room at 9:30. Monday, May 6th, we had breakfast and left San Antonio at 8:20. It was a nice cool day for traveling, and we got to Laredo at noon. We ate at our exclusive dinner club, the one with the golden arches. Maureen went to the restroom before we got a table. I found one, and when she returned she could not pick me out of the crowd. At that time I had a black, turned down at the ends mustache. The place was full of Mexicans who were dark like me. Nearly all of them had black turned down mustaches. While in Laredo, I paid a visit to an insurance company, who specialized in liability insurance for Americans traveling into Mexico. I had checked into this before leaving on our trip. Our neighbors that live about a mile to the west of us, Ed and Lena Bunce, had taken a trip into Mexico several years before. They were probably in their 60s at the time. While traveling down a highway they had a collision with another car, and the Mexican driving it was killed, and I think Lena had a broken hip. They were in a heap of trouble. Being unable to speak Spanish, they could not communicate with anyone. Regardless of the facts, they would probably be the party at fault. Fortunately for them, an American tourist, who just happened to be an attorney, was visiting there, and heard of the plight of the Americans up in the hospital. As luck would have it, they were practically neighbors. He was from the town of Mound City, Missouri, located about 30 miles to the northwest of Cosby. He was able to extract them out of a real bad situation, and see that they got back home. I don't know any of the details of how this was accomplished, but without a doubt, it probably cost them a sizable amount of cash. That was the reason that I purchased the insurance that was viable in Mexico. We crossed the border into Nuevo Laredo and stopped at the customs station where they went through our luggage. We passed inspection and headed into the heart of the city. As soon as we crossed the border, I became uneasy, and remained that way, until our return to the States. We could not read the street signs, nor could we communicate with the throngs of people on the streets. Somehow we had to locate the highway leading to Monterrey. We started getting to the outer edge of the city and had no idea where we were. We came upon an interesting scene that certainly did not bolster our feeling of security. A car and a truck were stopped in the highway, and several uniformed men in combat fatigue swarmed around the car. Their uniforms appeared to be military, and they all had automatic weapons trained on the vehicle and its occupants. After traveling on down the highway, I decided to pull over and try to determine if we were on the proper route to get us to Monterrey. I was scanning our road map when a car pulled off the highway and stopped in front of us. What luck! They had Indiana license plates. It was a man and woman about our age, and they were also looking for the highway to Monterrey. He was a deputy sheriff and they were also on vacation. We determined that we were on the right road, so we hooked up with them and had a 2-car caravan headed south. We arrived in Monterrey at 4:30 p.m., 3:30 Mexico time. This was no small town. The population was around 1 million. Believe it or not, we came upon a herd of unattended Holstein cows grazing along the parkway. It was a sight to behold. We were driving along the foot of a mountain that loomed up beside the city. Shortly after seeing the cows, we saw a Ramada Inn sign. There was an arrow pointing to the right. After making the turn, we could see the motel perched atop the mountain, and we began to wind our way up to the top. It had been a gambling casino prior to being purchased by Ramada. Somehow the name Hilltop Hacienda sticks in my memory. I think that was what it was previously called, or may have still been. But after so many years I'm not sure. We dined in an outdoor garden that provided a fabulous panoramic view of the lights of the city below. The waiters who served us were in formal dress and were quite impressive. We had a fine meal, accompanied with complimentary tequila sours. We were living high on the hog for a couple of country hicks. We could look out the backside of the hotel and see the little school kids playing in the schoolyard, and some of their humble dwelling places nearby. It was quite a contrast to our eloquent hotel. During our short stay there, we hired a Mexican guide to take us on a tour of the city. His name was Ralph and his wife Linda. They had at one time lived in Kansas. I don't recall why, but we asked them to take us to one of the cemeteries. It turned out to be an interesting place. Just by chance, the concrete top of one of the graves was open, perhaps in preparation for a burial. This of course gave us an opportunity to peer down into it. It was like looking down into a large cistern. However, instead one of water, there were several generations of a family in caskets stacked neatly one upon the other. At 6:30 Wednesday morning, May 8th. We left the motel and started working our way through the bustling city of Monterrey. We were heading for the States. One of the things among many that puzzled us was seeing people during the early morning hours, coming out of shacks heading out to work, wearing white shirts and dresses. How they could be so neat and clean looking was quite an accomplishment. Some of the poorer Americans should take lessons from them. We arrived at the border town of Reynosa, just across the Rio Grande River from McAllen, Texas. We crossed the river and stopped to pass through U.S. Customs. Once again I was mistaken for a Mexican citizen. The customs officer started talking to me in Spanish and I told him that I did not speak Spanish. In mid-sentence he switched to English. We cleared customs and entered McAllen, at high noon. We drove a short distance to the town of Weslaco, where we ate at a Dairy Queen. In the afternoon we drove up to Rockport, where we ate supper. It was just a few miles north of Corpus Christi. That evening we made it up to Bay City, where we spent the night. The following morning we left at 8 o'clock and headed for Galveston. We looked that city over and headed northwest, passing through Houston. It was a clear hot afternoon, and we made it all the way to Paris, 18 miles from the Oklahoma border. We spent the night there and I was having a severe stomach ache and wasn't feeling a bit good. I probably had come down with a severe case of Montezuma's revenge. For the uninformed, this is a type of food poisoning suffered by countless Americans who have eaten the food south of the border. The following morning I still had it, but after we got underway it started getting somewhat better. We arrived at Aunt Ann and Uncle Clifford Smith's home on the Grand Lake of the Cherokees in northeastern Oklahoma. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Cousin Jimmy Geneva Nelson, and husband Meredith Budd, were also there. Another couple, Hugh and Nina something, were also there. We all went fishing and spent the night with them. I don't recall where we all slept, somehow we managed. The next morning at 10:30 we headed for home, stopping at the Veterans Hospital at Leavenworth to visit Billy Frank. He was doing somewhat better. From there we went up to Troy, and tea-topped by my mom and dad's for a short visit before heading home. We also stopped by Mom and Dad Hines and Merritt and Sherry Hines, on our way. It was 5 p.m. when we finally got home. We had an enjoyable trip. But it sure was nice to be home, and to sleep in our own bed. The following day was May 12th, Mother's Day. May 15th, was the last day of college for the summer, and Jimmy and Kent Soden had been talking about going to Colorado to work during the summer vacation. Kenny's first sister, Cindy, was personal manager for a molybdenum mine, west of Denver. Kenny had a job there, and wafted the boys to come out. Jimmy, Gary, and Kent left for Colorado at 9:30 a.m., on Saturday, May 25th. They took Rent's little red Ford. Maureen said that she felt like she did the day they started to school. We both missed them and were wishing that they were back home already. That evening Steve Jarrett came out to get the sailboat, and pulled it to the lake. The following day Maureen and I bought some fried chicken at the Colonel's, and stopped at the roadside park near Troy Connor Sevenas, and had a picnic. We drove on west, to a lake near Horton, and ate supper there with Brother Bud and Lou. On the way home, we stopped at Mom and Dad Jarrett's for a brief visit. Some of the restaurants that we frequented back in those days were the Sirloin Stockade at the Belton Mitchell, Southgate, the New Ground Round, and Lay's at the Belton Picket. Jimmy called the evening of May 29th and said that Gar went to work in the moly mine. Jimmy had a kidney infection and would have to wait 5 days to see if it cleared up before he could be hired. He also wanted us to take his '69 Toyota to the garage and have it repaired. Then drive it out to Colorado for him. We limped it down to Toyota and they found that it had a burned out valve. The following day we picked it up at 5:30 and I drove it and followed Maureen, who was driving our car. We headed out across Kansas at 5:30 in the evening. We drove until we reached Phillipsburg. We were about 300 miles into Kansas. We got a motel for $10 and a good night of rest. The following morning we were on the road by 7 o'clock. We ran into some snow showers up in the mountains, and arrived at the boys' condominium at Georgetown. At 1 p.m. they all shared the rent on a condo, in the picturesque little village that was situated high in the Rockies about 50 miles west of Denver. Kenny's folks, Earl and Evelyn First, were also there for a visit. We all went out for supper at a place called the Red Ram. We didn't realize it then, but a woman who would later become famous as a television star, Roseanne Barr, may have been our waitress. She was working there during that period in time. We sure enjoyed getting to see our boys again, even if it was a brief visit. Sunday morning we ate breakfast with the boys, and headed out toward home at 9 o'clock. It was a hard drive and we arrived home 12 hours later. And yes, we missed our boys a lot. The following evening Jimmy called, and he passed his physical and went to work that day. Gar said that day he walked 4 miles, and dug a ditch. That same day I worked on the tractor mower, and we sold the remainder of our soybeans. Maureen said it sure is awfully quiet without our boys around. Joe Carr was still living back at the cabin, and the following day he invited us back for supper. He had barbecued pork chops and baked potatoes over an open fire. It was delicious, and it helped lift our spirits a bit. The following day Joe got his pickup stuck back at the cabin, and Maureen and I pulled him up to the house. The next day was Saturday and Maureen and I went into town and ate with John and Wilma Schussler at the Sirloin Stockade, and then went to our club, the Eagles Lodge on the Belt Highway. We danced to the music of the Sylvie brothers. Bill and Bob Sylvie were younger brothers of Carl Sylvie, a kid that went to school with me back in the 30s at McKinley. They were country and western musicians, and for several years they really packed in a crowd at the Eagles every Saturday night. Like most barbers I always took Mondays off. On June 10th, Bobby Jarrett and I played golf at my favorite course. It was a 9-hole par 3 course called Shady Lane. It was a couple of miles south of St. Joe, on Highway 169. At this writing 27 years later, they are still in business, but I no longer pursue the game. I had been lobbying through my friend Mel White, for a job as an inspector for the State Board of Barber Examiners. Mel had recently been appointed to serve on the board, by Governor Christopher Kit Bond. The following day on June 11, 1974, I was notified that I had been accepted for the position of inspector. It was a job that I could work at part-time, and still continue running my shop at the hotel. Mom and Dad Jarrett came for a visit, and were driving a new Chevrolet Nova. Had this been 30 years earlier, back in Erlon, this would have been a major event. They also informed us that Janie and Nelson got a divorce ending their 12-year marriage. We felt so sorry for little 9-year-old Angelia, and 7-year-old Jennifer. My sister Jane Ellen married Jim Daring June 15, 1974. He was formerly from northwestern Arkansas. June 21, Joe Carr started his vacation, and headed out to Colorado to see the boys. Earl and Evelyn brought some things out home to send to Kenny, and we had some things for him to take to Jimmy and Gary. That same day it was 100 degrees and windy. Maureen met me at Sweet and Betty Swenson's and we all headed out for the Marine Corps League State Convention. We stopped at Sedalia for supper, and arrived at the Osage Host on the Lake of the Ozarks at 9 p.m. the following day. Maureen laid around the pool and sunbathed while I attended meetings. That evening we attended the banquet and dined on steak. The following morning was Sunday and we left the Osage house and headed for home. Once again stopping at Sedalia for dinner. We made it home at 3:30, and ate back at the cabin. The following day Maureen was feeling a little down, so I prepared supper. Avocado sandwiches and Spanish rice. On June 29th, Merritt and Sherry Hines rode with us down to Royals Stadium. The Friendly 20 Club had reserved seats and we all watched the Royals defeat the Oakland A's, 2-0. We were all happy to see the Royals beat the Oakland Athletics, formerly the Kansas City A's. Joe Carr got back from Colorado and filled us in on the boys' activities out there. Maureen and I took Sarge, our beautiful big German Shepherd dog, for a ride in the back of our pickup truck. On the 4th of July 1974, we were building a patio in our backyard. I mixed cement and poured it, while Maureen floated it down and finished it. She did a pretty smooth job. Many years later it's still there. On Sunday, July 7th, we attended the Marine Corps League picnic at Bill Wallace's on South 11th Street Road. It was next door to Howard and Gertrude McCaig's former home, when Brother Bob was dating their daughter Joyce. I felt right at home there. I had ridden my bicycle down that street many times back when I was a kid in Erlon. They had a swimming pool and horseshoe pitching matches. They also had lots of good food and beverages. A large crowd usually turned out for this annual event. Bill had attended Benton High School with me, and I don't believe he completed school. He may have joined the Corps when 1-1 was 17. He retired after 20 years service. His son David had also served in the Corps, and belonged to the MCL. Monday, July 8, I drove to Jefferson City to attend a meeting of the state barber inspectors, and returned home the same day. A week later, I inspected Ray Clinton and Danny Norris's barber shop at Clarksdale, and they passed inspection. On July 23, my little sister Janie brought her new husband Jim by the Robidoux barber shop to meet his new brother-in-law. We had lunch down the street at Bill Wetzel's 409 Club, at 409 Francis Street. By this time urban renewal had worked its way to our block, and buildings were crashing to the ground across the street from the hotel. Bill had recently moved from across the street at 408, after his side of the block had been destroyed. Director of Urban Renewal Tom Paul was cleaning the town up, and the wrecking ball was swinging with a vengeance. Rumors were flying about which buildings would go, and which would be spared. The elegant old Robidoux Hotel had seen a steady decline in business since the construction of the Est Hills Shopping Center. From time to time it had been mentioned as a likely candidate for implosion. I had been wondering about the possibility of relocating somewhere in the city of St. Joe. Back in '62, when the East Hills Shopping Center was built, the exodus of downtown business soon turned into a stampede up Frederick Avenue, headed for the Belt Highway. It was only a matter of time before the old downtown business establishments of Townsend and Wall, Plymouth Clothing Company, Dirge and Bodenhausen, Ironbenders, and A.J. August, and scores of other retailers would no longer reign supreme in old downtown St. Joseph. Hotel manager Robert Barry had seen the handwriting on the wall, and had left the city for obvious reasons. The American National Bank owned the hotel through receivership, and they hired R.M. Max Fry, the manager of the Elks Club in the hotel, to take over as manager. No one was sure what they intended to do with it. It was rumored that they were trying to find a buyer for it. And we were just taking it day by day. For 15 years Lloyd Adams had been manager of the hotel garage. He was promoted to assistant manager of the hotel, and in 1974 Max Fry stepped down as manager of the hotel, and Lloyd became manager. Mr. Fry stayed on in an advisory capacity, as vice president of Roebuck, the holding company created to manage the hotel for the bank. Lloyd and his wife Deanna were friends of ours, and also attended dances at the Eagles Lodge on the Belt Highway. They had a farm a few miles north of us near Union Star. The situation was becoming very unstable and I wasn't sure what to do. So T continued to play it by ear, waiting to see how things would work out. On Wednesday, July 24, 1974, James Jr. celebrated his 21st birthday. He was officially an adult. The weekend following his birthday, the mine was holding an open house, so on Friday, Maureen and I drove to Kansas City, and took Frontier Airlines to Denver. The flight took 1 hour, and we were met at the airport by Gar. And he drove us out to Georgetown. We arrived at 9:30 p.m. and managed to find room to sleep in their condo. Saturday morning we toured the mine and it was quite an adventure. Molybdenum is an alloy that is used to strengthen steel. I'm sure that my dad and older brothers were very familiar with this product. They have used tons of it in the huge electric smelting furnace at the foundry. This was the Henderson mine that we were touring. Amex already had 2 molybdenum mines in operation. The Urad, and the Climax. The Climax had been around since back in the 50s, and throughout the years Urad supplied most of the world with moly. This is one of the largest deposits of molybdenum in the world. The Henderson is estimated to contain 300 million ton, and will represent a 10-year investment of over $300 million. The development of the Henderson actually began in 1967. It covers 22,750 acres in 2 counties, Grand and Clear Creek. During its construction, there had been 200 subcontracts let. The mine site lies on the east side of the Continental Divide, and contains 3 shafts. The one that we were lowered into, was 28 feet in diameter, and reached into the bowels of the earth 3,100 feet. It was one of the largest shafts in North America. The gigantic hoist has only 1 cable, and is capable of lifting huge loads of men and equipment. The cavernous tunnels were large enough to accommodate large trucks and muckers. Large earth-moving machines. The mill where the moly will be processed, is 14 miles away on the west side of the Continental Divide. When everything was completed, the ore would be taken out through the bottom of the mountain by rail, passing through a 9.5-mile tunnel. The system featured a double-track, Lift 6 automated trains running round trips constantly carrying approximately 660 tons on each trip. It will cost $40 million to build. The work went on around the clock, and the Cosby boys worked different shifts. They said it didn't make much difference what shift you worked, all of the lighting below the surface was artificial and in essence everyone worked the night shift. The tunnels, and supply and maintenance shops were well lit, however back where the blasting and drilling was taking place, was another matter. We also learned that Jimmy was working with a fellow named David Skinner, who was an assistant shift supervisor. They were involved in all aspects of the operation, that included drilling, setting charges, blasting, and hauling out the WFTH mucker. This was news that his parents were not thrilled to hear. We had been worried about their occupation from THP start, and would remain uneasy, up to and including their last day in the mine. Gary was working in various parts of the mine, doing a variety of jobs. We were to later learn that he was working on one dotty surface, trying to clear a blockage in one of the large hoses that were used to spray the walls of the tunnels with a plaster-like substance. He took a coupling apart that was under high pressure. When he did, it blew him about 50 feet down the mountainside. He was not seriously injured, and Jimmy said that when he arrived back at the condo with a sheepish look about him, it took a little bit of prodding before he told his brother what had happened. Needless to say, he was sore for a few days, but I don't believe that he lost any time off work. Every employee was issued a metal tag, that they attached to their miner's belt. Each had an identification number on it, and they would file past the board where the tags hung, and they were required to snap it to their belt, and put their hard hat on before starting their work shift, and of course all miners' hard hats were equipped with a light. Where they exited the elevator at the end of their shift, they would hang the ID tag back on the board in its designated place. The reason for these procedures was to be able to account for everyone's whereabouts in case of an accident. Mines were not the safest place in the world to work, but they paid top wages. It was more than the boys had ever earned. One day Jimmy was surprised and delighted, when he encountered another miner whose big brown eyes were looking at him from beneath a hard hat. It was that cute little girl Christy, who had been our teenage waitress at the Idlewild Lodge and Restaurant, back in 1970. They had a nice visit, but he learned much to his disappointment, that her last name had been changed since he had last seen she was now a married woman. When we had finished our tour of the mine, we returned to Georgetown. That evening we all went out to Oat, and to second the sights of the town, and celebrate Jimmy's birthday. We took in the Red Ram, the Crazy Horse Inn, and the Peck House. Many years later we would learn that a woman who would become a big TV star and have her own sitcom show, had been a waitress at one or all of the places at the Arnie we were there. She very likely served our table. Her name was Roseanne Barr, and the name of the show was Roseanne. The following day was Sunday, July 28, 1974. Kenny first, Kent Snowden, Jimmy, Gary, Maureen and I, and a girl who lived in a neighboring condo, headed up to Jones Pass. We brought a picnic basket along, and a bottle of fine wine, and had our bon voyage party. We got rained on a bit before we got to the bottom of the mountain. In the evening the boys took us to Denver, and we bid them farewell, and left at 9:40 via Continental Airlines. EARL had been a very enjoyable trip, and I know the boys enjoyed having us out to see them, and we got to see firsthand where they worked and what the mine was like. The next morning Maureen went back to work, and I got a phone call from my brother Bud. He was at St. Joseph Hospital, in Kansas City. He called to tell me that his son Steve had been in a bad car wreck, 2 days ago. He was in serious condition and the 22-year-old boy that was with him had died en route to the hospital. His name was Conrad Alexander, and was the younger brother of a woman that Bud had went with for several years. When I arrived my brother Bud and his wife Lou Venna, my former sister-in-law Rennie, and husband Callan Marshall, and my cousin Geneva Jimmy Nelson, were there. Steve was off the critical list, and would make it. He had some broken bones and cuts and bruised. Maureen and I had been talking about buying the boys a mobile home, for a homecoming surprise. I stopped her in St. Joe to shop around, and found one that pretty reasonable in price, and in good condition for its age. We bought it for $1,500, and they said they could deliver it the following week. The boys would be home August 17th, so we had time to get a few things done on it before their arrival. August 5th, they delivered it, and we had them set at about 100 yards, to the east of our house. That afternoon Jimmy Schottel brought his backhoe out and dug trenches for the water and electric lines, and a pit for the septic tank. Some of Jimmy and Gary's friends heard through the grapevine about the trailer, and that evening 3 of them showed up to see for themselves this wondrous playhouse. T got the water hooked up and set up the old military surplus field phone. From the trailer to our house. We had been using it for a cabin-to-home communication, but had not been using the cabin very much recently. Wednesday evening, August 7th, Maureen and I went to the hospital in KC to see Steve. They did surgery on his shoulder, and he was doing fine. The next day, President Nixon resigned the presidency. 2 of his Zhao-ranking staff people burglarized the Democrat headquarters, and were apprehended on the premises. There were no big secrets found, and no money was taken, because there was no money. All that was there, was a drawer full of I-0Us that were left over from their last campaign. Instead of throwing the 2 erstwhile Junior G men to the wolves, he tried to cover for them. And true to form, the Democrat House and Senate, and their leftist cohorts in the media, jumped onto him like a pack of starved dogs in a butcher's shop, and drummed him right out of the presidency. The contented looks on the faces of the TV news anchors told the 7V whole story. They had finally succeeded in dog what they had been working on throughout Richard Nixon's political career. Contrary to the way the media portrayed him, he was a decent and honest man, and a very capable president, who had just finished extracting our troops from a very bloody war in Vietnam. A conflict that he had inherited from his 2 Democrat predecessors. It was a sad day for America, and the media would continue to dance on his grave for the next 25 years, and we are still counting. I'm afraid my partisanship is showing a bit, but I knew a different Richard Nixon than the media had portrayed. Several years down the road, America would see a genuine criminal and scoundrel occupy the White House, but that's another story. The boys arrived home on August 17th. Their summer had been quite an experience, and one that they would remember all the rest of their lives. They were sure happy with their new home, and they couldn't get enough of their mom's home cooking. That was something that they had really missed. Steve came out to stay a while with the boys while recuperating, and they registered for the fall semester at Missouri Western State College. Jimmy majored in biology, with a minor in chemistry, and Gary majored in music, and they both planned to obtain certification to teach. Kent Snowden was a pre-med student at the University of Missouri, at Columbia. We had our annual Labor Day weekend campout at Lake Perry, and our customary drenching of rain. In September of 1975, I learned that the old Hotel Robidoux would not be saved from demolition. It was crunch time, I had to excrete or get off the pot. I had been thinking for some time that I would like to build a barber shop at home, and I decided to do just that. During the second week in October, Maureen and I took a week of vacation, and on October 13, 1975, her and I staked out and strung lines for the foundation. It would be located in our backyard, facing the driveway, with stairs running up the terrace to the shop. We had some dirt work done that widened the driveway to the west, to accommodate parking. 2 days later we rented a trencher and dug the water lines and the trench for the foundation footing, and there was no turning back, the building was underway. November 2, 1974 was a rainy night, so we had our annual Jarrett Wiener roast in our barn. A good time was had by all, in spite of the rain. It was a soothing sound to hear the pitter-patterning on the tin roof of the barn. Bud's wife Lou Venna did not attend the festivities with him, so he spent the night at our house. On November 4, 1974, after 2 children and about 10 years of marriage, my brother Bud and his wife Lou were divorced. Maureen's company went on strike, and she was forced to walk the picket line. Most of the time she sat in her lawn chair around a campfire, and did her needle work at the entrance of the research farm near Cosby. One day her tranquility was interrupted when things started to spin out of control. A convoy of trucks approached the entrance to the farm, and some of the hotheads began to throw boards with nails in them, in front of the lead truck that was attempting to deliver cattle to the farm. The personal manager was also in the truck taking photos of some of the more radical strikers that were involved in the vandalism. Also accompanying the caravan were officers of the Sheriff's Department and the Highway Patrol. It was exciting, but Maureen was getting a little uneasy when it looked like things could become ugly. The only reason that she was in the Union was because it was mandatory. She managed to get a temporary job in the drug department of the Woolco store in St. Joe, and went to the picket line during her off hours. She was very happy when the strike was finally settled, and she could get back to her job in the research lab. Manning a picket line was not her cup of tea. November 21, 1974, Mike and Sherry Jarrett moved the DR mobile home from Rushville, Missouri, to a lot near us. It was across the road from the northeast corner of our North 40. They rented a concrete pad, equipped with water, sewage, and electrical hookups, from Floyd Bridge. The boys were out of college for the week of Thanksgiving, and Jimmy, Gar, Steve and I spent the next few days helping Mike set and level his trailer. This year we didn't have our traditional Jarrett family Thanksgiving dinner. I am at a loss as to why we didn't. I guess everyone had something else to do that day. Maureen prepared a meal fit for a king. We had ham, sweet potatoes, scalloped oysters, green beans, cottage cheese, jelly, cranberries, and mincemeat pie. In the afternoon the boys and I went to the timber to saw wood. We worked up some for us to burn, and some for the boys to sell. This enables us to work off the vast quantity of the food that we had consumed. We had a pretty good snow during the night, and more the next day. Gar and Harry, Steve Woodward, took a load of wood to town to sell. Jimmy and Bev were out playing in the snow, and she stayed for supper. During December, I spent a lot of time in St. Joe, with my Marine Corps League buddies, cleaning and repairing toys, during our Toys for Tots drive. Saturday afternoon, on December 14th, Maureen rode along with me, to inspect barber shops. We went to Pattonsburg, Gallatin, Trenton, Cameron, Stewartsville, and Clarksdale. The following day Mom and Dad Jarrett were over to our house for dinner, and they also visited with Mike and Sherry. The next day my broth bud was out for a visit, and also on that day Jimmy and Gary were at the college taking their semester exams. Nearly all of the Jarrett clan gathered at Yo and Shirley's, a mile north of Troy, Kansas, on Mosquito Skeeter Creek Road, on Tuesday evening, Christmas Eve. Everyone was there, with the exception of Shelley Arnold, Donnie Jarrett, and Bobby and Janice Jarrett. During the winter, Jimmy and Gary and their friends were do''ng a lot of ice skating on the ballast pit at Clarksdale. November 8th, they went to Troy, Kansas to watch their cousin Mac Jarrett play football. After the game they stopped by Grandpa and Grandma Jarrett's, for coffee and cake. Saturday night, November 9th, we and the boys attended the Marine Corps League's annual birthday ball at Post 11, of the American Legion, on the northwest corner of 7th and Edmond. Jimmy took Bev, and I think Gar soloed it. New Year's Eve of 1974-75 was a wild one. The day started with sleet and snow, then cleared off at noon. Several of us went to Leonard Schuessler's for supper. At 10:30, Jimmy and Bev, Gar, Harry Woodward, Mike, and Sherry Jarrett, Steve Jarrett, and Maureen and I went to the home of Steve's cousin, Jim Anglin, for yet another party. Maureen and I stayed until 1:30, then headed for home, looking forward to our warm bed and a good night's sleep, but it turned out to be everything but that, and 1975-03 did not get any better as the year wore on. It would be a year of sadness and loss. We turned off the highway at Avenue City, and headed for Cosby. We passed by Route W, and when we topped Carlton-Dixon's Hill, a red glow appeared on the horizon straight ahead. We knew that someone's being was on fire, and it was in a direct line with our house, 7 miles ahead. After passing through Cosby the glow became much brighter, and my foot became a little heavier on the accelerator. As we left the state highway onto our road our hearts were beating faster. We could just see all of our belongings going up in flames. It was a scary feeling, and we had just about resigned ourselves that it was our house. But when we topped Orley Tate's Hill, we breathed a sigh of relief. It was lot ours, but Wall, the home of our neighbors to the west of us, Herman and Sharon Rains. It was a total loss, and had nearly burned to the ground by the time we arrived. We of course were relieved that it wasn't ours, but felt real bad about our neighbor's plight. We spent a good part of what was left of the night at the fire. Herman, Sheldon, and their son and daughter, Randy and Terry, barely escaped with their lives. By 3:30 a.m., the fire had burned down, so we had the Rains come over to our house for some warmth and relaxation. At 6 o'clock morn cooked a big breakfast, after which they returned to what used to be their home, and we finally went to bed at 7:00 a.m. After a couple of hours of fitful sleep, I GCT up and went back over to Rains for another look during the daylight. There were several people milling around looking at what used to be a home. I watched football on 4, and Jimmy and Bev were out for supper in the evening. Also on this day, my mother was celebrating her 78th birthday. The following morning was Thursday and Maureen headed cut to work, as the snow began to fall. It snowed between 3 to 6 inches, and she made it there and back without a mishap. Mike took Sherry, Jimmy, Rev, Gary, Maureen and I, for rides in an old Chevy car, that they had named the Bushwhacker. We was spinning around and jumping ditches over on the North 40 and having lots of fun. Maureen took her ride, and then sent home and babysat little 9-month-old Jason, while the rest of us kids played. Later in the evening we all went sled riding. The following day our neighbor Wayne Schottel came by collecting money for the Rains, and we donated $50. The following Sunday, Maureen and I drove down to the Veterans Hospital at Lansing, Kansas, to visit Bill and Milton Lee Chambers. They were in the final stages of Huntington's chorea. On Thursday, January 16, 1975, my little sister Janie was busy giving birth to Tanya Beth Daring, at their home in Troy, Kansas. She rushed her mother into delivering at home, with her daddy Jim, assisting. That same evening Jimmy was keeping Beth his lady friend company, while Maureen, Gar, and I were ice skating on the pond. Monday, January 20th, was my day off, and Maureen set out for work in the Toyota. We had snow and ice the previous night, and when she came to Heller's Curve west of Cosby, she was driving very slow but still lost control on the ice, and did a complete turnaround, and ran nose first into a deep ditch on the north side of the road. She said it was a real funny feeling going around like that on the ice. She was not hurt, but the front of her car was. She summoned me from a nearby telephone, and I called a tow truck, and let it out to rescue her. We were standing in the road waiting for the tow truck, when Tom Mackey, the fellow who owned the grocery store and cold storage locker plant, rounded the curve and did a 360-degree turn on the ice. He had been going very slow, but that made little difference. He duplicated what Maureen had done, except the part of going in the ditch. Our car was damaged to the tune of $560. That doesn't sound like much in today's world, but back then that was over 17% of what the car had cost new. Our old friend and auto body man John Schussler fixed it up like new for us. Thankfully we had it insured. The following Monday, January 20th, I bought a used 1969 Dodge pickup truck at Savannah, for $700. Ray and Faye Gurwell were friends of ours, that lived 21/2 miles south of us. Maureen and Ray graduated together from Savannah High, in the class of '48. His wife was also a graduate of Savannah High, and was the daughter of Pryor and Bertha Schottel, and a sister to Fern Dixon, and her brother was Pryor Schottel Jr. They had 3 sons and a daughter. The oldest son Terry was 20 years of age, and was a good friend of Jimmy and Gary. And like their parents, he and Gary graduated from Savannah High School together. They also played softball on the Cosby team together. Terry was catcher, Jimmy third base, and Gary left field. Their second child was Catherine Faye, who was 17, and their third was 14-year-old Jimmy. The youngest was Timothy, who was 11. They called their place the Hill High Farms. It was a family operation, and they raised Red Angus cattle and hogs. On Sunday, February 2nd, at 2:20 p.m. a terrible tragedy happened in their lives. Their son Jimmy was doing his chores, and was headed down the road on their farm tractor. When he attempted to turn into a field south of their house where the livestock were kept, he was going too fast and the tractor upset, crushing him to death beneath it. I will always fondly recall the night that some little boys were having a ball game at the Cosby ballpark. They were probably 5 or 6 years old, and Ray was helping coach them. His youngest boy Tim was playing center field, and seeing as how there was no action that far out. He needed to use the toilet and probably couldn't hold it any longer, so he decided to water the grass. I was standing by Ray, and happened to catch this drama unfold. I started laughing and said, "Ray, look what your son is doing." Ray said, "Oh no," and started hollering at him in an effort to get him to shut it off, but alas, it was too late. They were some of the finest people in the community, and we had a lot of admiration for them. Jimmy's funeral was on our Gary's birthday, February 4, 1975. Maureen and I were working and couldn't attend, but we did make it to the funeral home. During the year of 1975, another tragedy occurred. Jerry Arnold's nephew, Terry Martinson, was a passenger in a company plane, and while flying over Pennsylvania, all aboard were killed when it crashed. If you will recall, he was the little baby that made the trip up Pikes Peak with us back in 1948. He was 27 years of age at the time of his death. On February 11th, I headed out for Jefferson City, in a winter storm. It was raining, sleeting and snowing off and on all the way. I was still an inspector with the State Board of Barber Examiners, and we were meeting with our bosses, the State Board members. I spent the night in Jefferson City, and returned home the following day. That night Maureen and I attended a banquet at the Ramada Inn in St. Joe. State Attorney General John Danforth was the speaker. I was still involved in politics, and Mel White was still on the State Board of Barber Examiners, and our man in command was still Governor Christopher Kit Bond. Saturday, February 15th, Maureen's lower wisdom tooth had been dealing her fits, so I drove her to Stanberry, Missouri to the office of Dr. George Hansford. His office was located in the front part of his residence. He patronized my shop in the hotel, and over the years we had become good friends. Even though he was a very good dentist, he had a tough time doing the extraction, and Maureen had a tougher time of it. She developed an infection, and had to go to Dr. Kelly for some antibiotics, after which it turned out fine. Doc Hansford owned an airplane that he hangared at an airport at Albany, Missouri. He and I would occasionally go flying on his day off. One of the other things besides flying that bonded us as friends, was the fact that he had been a second lieutenant in the Army, and had served with a rifle company in Burma, fighting the Japanese during World War II. We had much in common. He had also been wounded in action. Doc eventually crashed his airplane, while making a landing, and ended up with a fractured jaw. He had his teeth all wired up to hold his jawbone in place while it healed. When he would visit St. Joe, he would usually pay a visit to the Pony Barn Lounge in the hotel. It was directly above the barber shop, and from there he would come down and avail himself of my services. The braces that held his jaw in place were becoming uncomfortable, so he asked me if I would adjust it for him. I said, "Are you sure that I can do this?" And he said that he would instruct me how. He sat in my barber chair, and I laid him back in it, and proceeded to adjust the wires and rubber bands that held his jaws in place. This was a sight to behold, a barber doing dental work on a dentist. We were reverting back a century or more, when barbers were also dentists, and physicians. I guess it turned out all right, his jaw healed up, and I didn't get any complaints or a lawsuit from my patient. Our beautiful German Shepherd dog Sarge had been running with Mike's dog Mitzi, and it got him in big trouble. He followed her over to Mike's house, and Greg was in the yard wrestling with Mitzi. Evidently Sarge thought they were fighting, and jumped in and bit Greg on the head. They had to take him to the doctor for stitches. Sarge had always been gentle, and had never showed any aggression before, but from that time on we kept him chained to his dog house. Mitzi would come over, and Sarge would break loose from his chain, and run the countryside with her. We never kept a dog that had to be chained, and we knew that something had to be done, when I drove the neighborhood looking for him, and found, he was nearly a mile from home. On February 24, 1975, I put Sarge's collar and leash on him, and when I loaded him into the car, the whole family was feeling bad. We had been a gentle, loving dog, and we were very attached to him. I took him to a St. Joe veterinarian, and as I led my beautiful dog into this strange place, and handed the vet his leash, Sarge looked up at me as if to say, "Is it all right for him to take me?" I don't recall of having shed a tear since I was a little boy. Even during all of the dreary, heartbreaking things that I had endured thus far in my life, but I came very close to it that day. It was one of the hardest things that I ever had to do, and I vowed that I would never again have a large dog, and have to go through that again. From the clinic I drove to the dog pound, and began my search for a young pup with small feet. Large feet indicates that the dog will be large as an adult. I soon learned that shopping for a dog to adopt can also be a very trying thing to go through. As I passed by all the cages, I stopped in my tracks, and knew that this was my dog. She was a little black and white, spotted pup, with short hair, and appeared to be a mixture of Sheltie and Border Collie. When I carried her into the house, everyone was still feeling sad about Sarge, but when they saw this little curly-haired pup, it was love with at first sight. We didn't know what to name her, however we began to call her a little fart. This soon evolved into "You're nothing but a little 2-point freep." We were making reference to the lowest point that can be scored in competitive farting. It stuck, and she would always be known as Freppy. Thursday, March 20th, I was at the barber shop, and shortly after a customer left, Willie and I were visiting, when we heard a sound up the street. At first we thought it was a gunshot. I told Willie that was going to see what was going on, and Willie said, "Jim, you had better stay right down here." Of course I didn't obey him, and headed up the stairs that open onto 5th Street. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a stream of blood running down the sidewalk and past our stairwell, and I looked up the sidewalk to find the source of the blood. A woman's body lay on the sidewalk in front of the east entrance to the hotel. My first thought was that the sound that I heard was a gunshot, and she had been gunned down. People were starting to converge on the scene, and suddenly it came to me. She had jumped from a window in the upper floor of the hotel, and the sound that we heard was her body striking the support of the entrance awning, prior to hitting the sidewalk. The police were soon on the scene, and one of them was marking with chalk around the body, and Signet was making a circle around the wig that she had been wearing. It was lying in the gutter, in front of our entrance. Later that day, hotel manager Lloyd Adams and I took the elevator up to the top fecker. We saw where she had removed a window screen from the window at the end of the hall. The window was still open, and we could see her foot tracks in dusty windowsill where she took the final step of her life. A lady who was a professional photographer had set up her studio 0 inches this floor. She said that she had rode up the elevator with the lady that jumped, and when they exited the elevator the woman asked her if this was as high as it went, and she said yes, this is the top floor. We learned from the newspaper that the woman had been a patient at the State Mental Hospital on Frederick Avenue. Soon after leaving the facility she ended her life. She was 32 years of age. On February 29th, Jimmy, Gary and I helped Herman Raines roof their new brick home that they were building. It would replace the one that burned New Year's Eve. It was a cold day and was spitting snow, and roofing hails were hard to hold. The following day, just like on schedule, Dad Hines planted his potatoes. The next evening, Mike and Sherry Jarrett, Steve, Jimmy, Gary, and Maureen and I went to Jack and Michelle Templeton's at Hempel Moe for a get-together. On March 23rd, the boys, Bev Keller, and Maureen and I went over to Yo and Shirley's for dinner, and to second their newly remodeled home. It was quite a step up from the old days down in Erlon. They each had a toilet, not a two-holer, and they didn't have to go to the backyard to use them. Maureen and I stayed home that night, and the boys went down to Steve and Mike's cousin, Jim Hawks, to make F-Jiddle guitar music with Dennis Buckley. In April my sister Janie was working as a switchboard operator at the Robidoux Hotel. On April 2, 1975, the temperature was 2 degrees, and we had 4 to 6 inches of snow, with 15-foot drifts that closed the roads and brought things to a screeching halt. 4 days later, when we usually mowed the yard for the first time in the spring, we celebrated our 23rd wedding anniversary. We had a Sunday dinner at Mom and Dad Hines, with Kerr sons, and Merritt and Sherry and their children Leslie and Kirk. 2 days later, on April 8th, my sister Janie's former father-in-law Dick England passed away. He was 60 years old and had been a giant of a man. At one time he was strong enough to grasp the rear axle of a John Deere B tractor and lift the wheel off the ground. Now that is strong. On May 17th, at 6:45 a.m., we set out on a trip in our Toyota Celica, for the Door Peninsula in Wisconsin. We arrived in Des Moines, Iowa. At 10 a.m. we ate the quick dinner at Hardee's for $3.06, and got 10 gallons of gas for $5.30, and our little Celica humming out Interstate 80 for Chicago. We left I-80 at Joliet, and headed north on 1 to 55, and arrived in downtown Chicago in mid-afternoon. We decided to see the Museum of Science and Industry, and Institute of Technology, SC. We headed down the bustling Lakeshore Drive. Traffic was heavy on Saturday afternoon, and I wasn't a happy caliper. When ye arrived at the facility, I couldn't find a parking spot, and just didn't like the looks of the place. I managed to get turned around and headed up Lakeshore northbound. I am not sure, but I believe there were 6 or 8 lanes of traffic, and they were packed solid with cars. When we got to the area of the Loop, and Grant Park, and the Sears building, all traffic, both north and southbound, came to a screeching halt. Up ahead we could see what had caused it. The drawbridge over the Chicago Sanitary Ship Canal was stuck in the raised position. As far back as the eye could see, was one huge parking lot. We had intended to gas up in Chicago, but discovered to our amazement, there were no gas stations in downtown Chicago. After sitting there with the engine idling for about an hour, I noticed that the fuel gauge was getting dangerously close to empty, and the heat indicator was easing up near the boiling level. We were getting into deep CACA. If our engine quit in this mess, and traffic began to move again, we would be holding up somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 or 400 cars behind us in our lane. We could be tarred and feathered by a screaming MCB. This was getting serious. Suddenly things started looking better. A car passed by us going south. How did it get across the drawbridge that was still raised? Traffic heading south started multiply a little. They had opened a gap at the bridge, and were routing cars one at a time over to the southbound lanes, and alternated the cars going through out of the all 5 lanes. It was a slow process, but our lane was moving slowly up. Soon we were heading through, and headed south, looking for the first turnoff we could find. Somehow we managed to get headed out of the Loop area, and found a service station. When we pulled in, she started boiling. When I popped the hood, the attendant said he wouldn't touch it. Somehow I got the cap off without getting scalded, and let it cool off a little. I filled it with Ivator and gassed up, paid the man, and got the hiccups. Out of there, headed north up 1 to 94, vowing to never to return to Chicago. I have passed by on the outskirts of that city, but after 27 years, I haven't broke that vow. Once I got headed north, I didn't let up on her, until we arrived at Gurnee. Darkness was close at hand and we were tired, and ready to grab the first motel that we came to. It certainly wasn't a Ramada, and was perhaps a little on the seedy side. The rent was $12.60. After occupying our room, we soon learned that a bunch of high school seniors were also guests of this fine establishment. The walls were paper thin, and they whooped and hollered half the night. We awoke in the morning and had breakfast, and headed north on 1 to 43 for Milwaukee. 50 miles later we passed through Sheboygan, and 24 miles farther we came through Manitowoc, and 40 miles later, we arrived at the city of Green Bay, located on the shores of the Green Bay. We just had to drive by the stadium and see the home of the famous Green Bay Packers football team. From there we headed up Highway 57 on the Door Peninsula. The body of water called Green Bay lay to our west, and Lake Michigan to the east. One of the highlights of the spring season in this area of Wisconsin are the cherry blossoms in bloom. We weren't disappointed, they were a sight to behold. About halfway up the peninsula we crossed a bridge that flows from Green Bay into Lake Michigan. This body of water actually cuts the peninsula in half. I suppose that technically speaking, you could call the upper portion an island, but I don't suppose anyone does. Just across the bridge we entered the little town of Sturgeon Bay, where we got a motel room. We continued on up to Gills Rock, on Highway 42. It was a little village at the tip of the peninsula, 85 miles north of Green Bay. 5 miles beyond this point is Washington Island, but is accessible only by boat. We ate supper at a restaurant at Gills Rock, called Tom Thumb's. It cost us $7, including a tip. We returned to Sturgeon Bay and spent the night. The following morning, we had breakfast. $4.24 including tip. About 8 miles below there, we turned off of Highway 57, onto Highway 42, and drove 10 miles south, to the town of Algoma, on the Lake Michigan side of the peninsula. We gassed up there, and bought some cheese, and jelly, toured a vinery, and bought some. We came down the shoreline to Manitowoc, and from there to Fond du Lac, where we stopped for the noon meal. $1.77. From there we headed southwest to Madison, the capital of Wisconsin. Traveling south from there, we saw signs advertising a Swiss history village called New Glarus. It was getting time to start looking for a place to spend the night, and this little Swiss Sea of sounded like fun. We weren't disappointed, it looked like what we imagined a Swiss village would look like. There was an old hotel that advertised a beer garden and a Swiss polka band. We had a great time listening to the band and visiting with the natives. Nearly everyone in the area were descendants of Swiss ancestors. We even bought one of their records, and we still have it, even though we no longer have a turntable to play it on. The following morning we left New Glarus at 8 o'clock h.m., and headed south, and stopped for breakfast at Monroe. While there we toured a cheese factory, and bought some cheese. We went south about 10 miles and crossed over the Illinois border, and went down at Hit 1-288 and motored into the Quad Cities of Rock Island, Moline, and Davenport. When we passed through Rock Island, my memory wandered back to the hills of Korea. This was Jake Jackson's hometown, and I wondered if any of his family was still there. And if his body had been sent home for burial. But I didn't suppose that I would ever know the answer to that. We stopped at the Amana Colonies, midway between Quad Cities and Des Moines. We toured the facility and ate a fabulous dinner there, then hit the trail for home. Yep. You guessed it, 4 days from home, and we were starting to have Cosby fever. We arrived home that evening at 8:45. Shortly after we got home, we were jolted back to reality. When the phone rang, it was my brother Bob. He called to inform us that our dad had a heart attack while on a visit to Uncle Cliff and Aunt Ann's in Oklahoma. He and brother Yo were going after them in Yo's station wagon. Yo put mattress in the rear, and he would use it as an ambulance to transport Dad back to St. Joe, and Mom would ride with Bob in Dad's car. The following evening, Maureen, the boys and I, visited Dad at the Methodist Hospital in St. Joe. He was in ICU, intensive care unit, but seemed to be his old usual self, and was growling about being in the hospital, but he said he was just fine. Dad had never had a problem with his heart or any other major medical problems, and we always assumed that he was in good health, and a vigorous man FCZ 78 years of age. Jimmy Ard Gary, and Steve Wachtward, took the sailboat to Brother Bob's place on Sugar Lake, for our Memorial Weekend campout. 39 Jarretts and associates turned out for the occasion. On May 26, I visited Dad at the hospital, and he was still in intensive care, and still complaining that he was doing fine and wanted to go home. 2 days later Bud and I visited him, and he out of ICU and rearing to get home. On Friday after work, Maureen and I went to see Dad. He was reeling good, and they had told him he could go home next week. The following day was Saturday, May 31st, and I was working in the shop at the hotel at this point in time. We had started closing the shop at noon on Saturday. A little before noon, nephew Bobby Jarrett was in for a haircut, and when I had finished, he wanted to go see his grandpa, so he and I went over to the hospital. We passed by the nurse's station, and were walking down the hall to Fad's room, when a nurse called out, "Sir, could you come back here?" We of course went back to see what she wanted. She said, "Are you Mr. Jarrett's son?" and I answered in the affirmative. She said, "The doctor would like to speak to you, would you mind stepping back here please?" Seeing how I had been around 45 years and had never been asked to set foot in the nurse's station before, I immediately sensed that something wasn't right. The doctor told me as gently as possible, that he had passed away a few minutes before we arrived. He had gotten out of bed to go to the restroom, and was struck by a massive heart attack, and was dead before he hit the floor. The official time of his death was 12:30 p.m. I think that I was in a state of shock. This moment seemed unreal. How could Dad be dead? He was too strong to ever die. To me he was invincible. The doctor asked us if we would like to go in and see him. At that moment, neither Bobby or I felt up to it. He went on to tell us that they had discovered that he had inoperable lung cancer, and he was sending him home to be with his family. I realized then, that his heart attack was a blessing. He would escape all the agony and suffering that cancer would surely have caused him, but there is no easy way to accept the loss of a parent. He had always been the solid rock for his kids to lean on. He would leave a vacancy that could never be filled. Now I had the terrible task of notifying the rest of the family. I can't recall for sure, but I think I asked Bobby to tell his dad, and him to notify Bud, and Suzanne, and I headed for Kansas. My first stop would have to be at my little sister's home, in Wathena. This would be extremely difficult. She was always her daddy's baby girl, and I was dreading the task before me. When I pulled up to her house, she was working in the garden, and Jim was in the house. She said something like, "What are you doing, just out running around?" I think she could tell by the rained expression that something wasn't just right. She said, "What's going on?" There was no easy way to tell her. She was heartbroken, and Jim came out the back door, grinning, and said something funny. It was then he saw me with my arms around Janie and her sobbing. He realized then something bad had happened. I departed, and headed for Troy, wondering how to tell my mother that the husband she married in this little town 50 years ago was gone. I decided to go to Yosho''L&E first, and have him go with me to tell Mom. He was the youngest of the sons, and he and Dad had always been very close. He handled it as well as could be expected, and we headed for Mom's house. I was glad my brother was with me. I think having us both there probably gave Mom more support. She handled it better than I had anticipated she would. That evening we all had a sad gathering at Mom's house in Troy. The following day we were back once again at the folks' home in Troy, and after dinner we all went to make the arrangements at the Colonial Funeral Home. It was a new funeral home, located on the southeast corner of 36th and Beck Road. The operators were friends of Yo's, Mr. and Mrs. Lester J. Shales. They lived in Wathena, Kansas. Monday, June 2nd, Jimmy went to work at the Quaker Oats Company, tossing 100-pound sacks of meal. This is the same old skyscraper that his daddy walked past on his way to the Saturday Motins at the Hickory Theater 35 years before. Monday evening we were all at the funeral home for the visitation. The following day, Tuesday, June 3rd, Jimmy was not allowed to get off work for Grandpa's funeral. He would always regret this, and say that if he could do it over, he would have quit his new job, rather than miss Grandpa's funeral. The funeral was conducted there the following day with Reverend Clarence Morrill officiating. Interment was in the Mount Auburn Cemetery, on Beck Road, in St. Joseph, Missouri. Dad's pallbearers were Earl Yarnell, George Welsh, C. Tommy Gibbons, Dale Yarnell, Paul Thornton, and Byron Waller. He was laid to rest near his parents and his maternal grandmother, and some of his siblings. There are a few major events in one's life that stands out above all the rest. And this was one of them. The head of our family was gone, and our lives would never be quite the same. On June 19th, like his brother did 2 years before, Gary started work at Casey Myers Ford, in St. Ch. Mom put the home in Troy on the market, and purchased one back at Clarksdale. It was on the north side of the town square, next to the old brick post office that used to stand there. Back in the late 40s it had been the home of Otto and Ethel Carroll during my heydays at Clarksdale. June 21st, ye moved Mom back to where all of her old friends were. Besides myself, those who helped move her were my brothers Bob, Bud, and Yo, and also Jimmy, Gary, Bobby Jarrett, Kent Snowden, and a foundry friend Bill Chase. Maureen and the women stayed over at the house in Troy to sell the things that Mom didn't want to move. On July 9, 1975, we sold our wheat, and I paid off our debts. From this day forward, we would never again buy anything on the installment plan. If we didn't have the cash, we didn't buy it, and thereafter life was much sweeter. On August 10th, the boys and I began to convert our old '62 Volkswagen into a dune buggy. The effort was worth it. We had a lot of enjoyment out of it down through the years. The handwriting was on the wall. The stately old Hotel Robidoux would soon succumb to urban renewal, and I had to get my act together. We decided to build a barber shop in our backyard, and then I would only have a few steps to my job instead of a 40-mile commute every day through rain, ice, and snow. Nephew Steve Jarrett volunteered to design and oversee the construction of it, and on October 13, 1975, Maureen and I took a week of vacation, and we measured and drove stakes and attached the strings, and the construction was underway. That sorry evening we went back to the cabin, and cocked stakes over an open fire. 2 days later I rented a digger from a rental company, and Jimmy and I dug the footing for the foundation and water line. Jimmy, Maureen and I drove to Clarksdale and picked up Mom, and ate at the cafe. We brought he/back with us for supper, and she stayed all night. On the cement truck came, and we poured the footing, with the leftover poured part of the patio. A few days later, I hired John Gann to dig a pit inside the foundation for the water line entrance, and also a pit to the of the structure for a septic tank. Friday, October 24th, the day before Maurier's 45th birthday. Elaine Stiegel brought a cake to work for her birthday. That evening Jimmy, Gary, and I took her to the Sizzling Sirloin for her birthday dinner. December 7th, 1975, I laid cement blocks for the foundation of the shop. On December 19th, Maureen and I went to the VA hospital at Leavenworth, Kansas with Marine Corps League to play bingo with the patients. We got to see Milt Chambers, but Billy Frank's condition had gotten worse, and he was moved to the Kansas City VA hospital. The Jarretts had Christmas Eve at the Clarksdale Lions Hall. There were 41 in attendance. January 1976, Steve, Jimmy, and I hung the rafters on the shop. Was 15 degrees, and spitting snow, and very miserable day, but we persevered. The following day we worked on the shop, and the temperature was -10 degrees, and the following day it was 10 degrees. 2 days later we had a heat wave, it was 42 degrees. January 22nd, we put the soffits on the shop, and the following day, we installed the windows. On the 18th, my old Marne buddy, Swede Robert Swenson came out and helped me do the wiring. The following day, we hung the rear storm door, and it snowed 6 inches. Our suffering paid off, and the follow-one NG day, Dad Hines helped me hang the front door, and we had it closed in. The 31st of January, 1976, was my last day in the old hotel. Willie Biddings was sad to see me go, and I would miss him too. He was one of the nicer persons that I had met along the road of life. Brother Bud, Jimmy, Gary, and Swede helped us move everything out. All that remained were the 4 walls, and that concluded my 16 years in downtown St. Joseph. I had fond memories of the old hotel and the people there. It was an experience that I would cherish for many years to come. I had become acquainted with some of the movers and shakers of St. Joe, and was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people. And was surprised to find that they were good people.